Chapter 1. The Beastlord's Vision. The Drakwald forest stretched out in all directions like a living labyrinth of gnarled trees and perpetual shadow. The air hung thick with the pungent stench of decay and the faint hum of chaos magic that permeated every inch of the cursed woodland. In the heart of this blighted domain stood Kael Bloodfang, the Beastlord of the Bloodclaw warherd, his hulking frame silhouetted against the pale light of a dying moon. Kael stood before the Herdstone, a massive pillar of crude rock and bone etched with unholy runes, its surface glistening with fresh blood offerings. The towering obelisk pulsed faintly, as if alive, radiating waves of raw chaos energy. Around it, his warherds stirred uneasily, scores of savage gores, braying ungors, and a handful of towering minotaurs, their restless grunts and snarls echoing through the night. They could feel the change in the air, the weight of unseen eyes upon them. Kael raised his massive axe, its blade jagged and smeared with the ichor of recent kills. His crimson fur was matted with the blood of foes, and the jagged horns atop his head gleamed like blades. The chaos moon, Morsleb, hung bloated and green above the treetops. Its sickly light, burning like twin coals of molten hatred, stared intently at the Herdstone. Kael's eyes spiraled around the car with a sense of yearning, longing, of something missing. Then it began. The ground trembled beneath his hooves, and a guttural, otherworldly hum rose from the Herdstone. The runes etched into its surface ignited in a blinding cascade of green and crimson flames. The warherd fell silent, their brutish faces turned upward in awe and fear. Kael dropped to his knees, not in submission, but in the throes of something far greater. His vision blurred, the forest around him dissolving into an ever-shifting void of chaos. Voices, multitudes of them, whispering, growling and screeching, filled Kael's mind. Each word was a shard of pain, yet their meaning was clear. Kael Bloodfang, hear us. A relic of immense power lies beyond the forest, in the domain of the Black Horn warherd. Claim it in our name. Wield it to unite the herds of the Drakwald and become our champion. The voices surged together into a cacophony, each syllable searing itself into Kael's soul. He saw flashes of a blood-stained relic, an axe radiating power so immense it warped the space around it. He saw the twisted forms of the Blackhorn warherd, their chieftain, Maldr the Defiler, standing before the relic in defiance. He saw visions of his own warherd, grown to a massive army of braying, slavering beasts, rampaging across the Drakwald with the relic held high. But there was more. The vision showed Kael himself, standing not as Beastlord, but as a demigod of chaos. His body was larger, warped and glorious, and he could feel the adoration and terror of thousands bowing before him. His blood burned with the promise of power, and his heart beat with the rhythm of unrelenting conquest. Kael roared, his voice echoing across the clearing and shattering the silence of the warherd. His warriors flinched, some falling to their knees, others braying in terrified submission. The light from the Herdstone dimmed, leaving only Kael's burning eyes visible in the darkness. Nero growled aloud, searching the massive crowd for Kael. "The gods have spoken," Kael thundered, his voice resonating with newfound authority. "A relic lies in the cursed lands of the Blackhorns. We will march, we will fight, and we will crush them beneath our hooves. Their relic will be mine, and through it the herds of the Drakwald will bow to the Bloodclaw." The warherd erupted into a cacophony of brays, roars, and guttural chants. Weapons clashed against shields, and massive hooves stamped the earth in wild frenzy. Kael turned to his Bray shaman, Chakra, who stood apart from the others, his eyes alight with twisted glee. "Prepare the rites," Kael growled. "The gods demand blood, and they shall have it." Chakra nodded, a malevolent grin spreading across his scarred face. "The winds of chaos blow strong tonight, my lord. We shall draw power from their blessing." Kael turned back to the Herdstone, his claws tightening around the haft of his axe. The vision still burned in his mind, driving him with a purpose greater than himself. The Chaos Gods had chosen him, and he would not fail them. As the first sacrifices were dragged screaming to the base of the Herdstone, Kael raised his axe high, the flames of chaos dancing in his eyes. The bloodletting began, and with it, the first steps of his warband's savage march into the unknown. Chapter 2. The Summoning of the Warband. The dark heart of the Drakwald forest echoed with the savage brays and howls of beastmen answering the call of their Beastlord. Kael Bloodfang stood before the Herdstone, its jagged surface glowing faintly with the lifeblood of recent sacrifices. The pulsing chaos energy it radiated filled the clearing with an oppressive air, twisting the shadows and warping the branches of the surrounding trees. Kael's crimson fur bristled in the unholy light as he turned his burning eyes to the gathering herd around him. The warband assembled, a disparate collection of brutal warriors drawn to Kael's promise of conquest and the favor of the Chaos Gods. Kael was no fool. To claim the Rift Axe, he would need a force as relentless and savage as the Drakwald itself. From among the throng, he began to summon his chosen. Chakra the Bray Shaman. The first to step forward was Chakra, a wiry Bray Shaman with piercing, slit-pupiled eyes that glowed faintly in the dim light. His twisted staff, adorned with bone fetishes and weirdstone shards, crackled faintly with chaos energy as he approached the Herdstone. His robes were tattered, stitched together with strips of hide and adorned with runes etched in blood. Chakra bowed slightly, his grin revealing jagged teeth. "Beastlord," he hissed, his voice a raspy whisper that seemed to cut through the guttural braying of the other beastmen. "The winds of chaos favor your path. I shall weave their power into your conquests." Kael regarded the Bray Shaman with measured approval. Chakra's cunning and mastery of sorcery would be invaluable, though Kael would keep him on a short leash. The Chaos Gods favored strength, but sorcery was an unpredictable blade. "You will serve me, Chakra," Kael growled. "Do not forget who wields the axe." Chakra's grin widened, his eyes narrowing in sly amusement. "Of course, Beastlord." His claws began. Then suddenly he stopped. Garruk Ironhorn. A thunderous bellow shook the clearing as Garruk Ironhorn entered. The massive Doomball towered above the other beastmen, his muscular frame covered in thick black fur matted with blood and grime. His horns, jagged and gnarled, glinted wickedly in the light of the Herdstone. In his clawed hands he carried a gray axe nearly as large as he was, its blade stained with the gore of countless victims. The warherd parted before him, their brays turning to murmurs of awe and fear. Garruk stomped forward, his hooves cracking the brittle ground, and halted before Kael. His beady eyes gleamed with savage intelligence as he snarled, "I fight for blood, Beastlord. Yours if you are weak, theirs if you are strong." Kael stepped closer, his crimson eyes locking with Garruk's. The tension between them was palpable, the other beastmen watching with bated breath. After a moment, Kael bared his fangs in a grin. "You'll get your blood, Garruk. Fight for me, and you'll drown in it." The Doombull snorted, his massive chest heaving with a grunt of satisfaction. "Then lead, Kael Bloodfang. I'll follow, as long as you're worthy." Skrina the Tracker. From the edge of the clearing, a shadowy figure emerged, moving with uncanny silence despite the brittle undergrowth. Skrinath, an Ungor known for his stealth and cunning, slipped forward, his wiry frame blending into the gloom. His dark eyes gleamed with sharp intelligence as he approached Kael, his twin daggers glinting faintly in the firelight. "Beastlord," Skrinath said, his voice low and sharp. "You need more than brute force to claim the Rift Axe. The Blackhorn warherd knows these woods well, but I know them better." Kael nodded, his gaze appraising the Ungor. Skrinath lacked the raw power of his larger kin, but his quick reflexes and knowledge of the forest made him invaluable. "You'll scout the path and strike where they are weakest," Kael commanded. "Prove your worth, or I'll feed you to Garruk." Skrinath smirked, his daggers spinning deftly in his hands. "You'll see, Beastlord. They won't even hear me coming." Ulgar Bonegrinder. A low, guttural growl rumbled from the darkness, followed by the heavy, lumbering steps of Ulgar Bonegrinder. The troll's massive form emerged from the shadows, his pale, warty skin glistening with slime. Chains rattled around his wrists and ankles, remnants of the bindings Kael had shattered when he had first subdued the creature. Ulgar's yellowed teeth ground together as he dragged a makeshift club, a tree trunk stripped of branches and bark, behind him. The other beastmen recoiled at the troll's stench and presence, but Kael stepped forward, meeting the creature's dim, glowing eyes. "Ulgar," Kael growled, his voice commanding. "You belong to me now. You will crush my enemies, or I will crush you." Ulgar tilted his massive head, his simple mind processing the words slowly. Then, with a grunt that shook the ground, he nodded. "Ulgar smash," he rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. Kael grinned, turning to address the gathered warherd. "Behold my chosen. Together, we will claim the Rift Axe. The gods demand blood, and we will drown this forest in it." The warband assembled. The warband brayed in savage approval, their weapons clashing together in a cacophony of bloodlust. Kael's chosen stood at his side, their presence radiating a terrifying strength. Chakra whispered incantations under his breath, his staff glowing faintly. Garruk flexed his massive muscles, his great axe resting on his shoulder. Skrinath melted back into the shadows, his daggers gleaming. Ulgar loomed over them all, his dull eyes fixed on Kael. As the Herdstone pulsed with the energy of their fury, Kael raised the Rift Axe high. "The gods demand strength," he roared. "And we will show them that none are stronger than the Blood Claw." The warband erupted into cheers, their savage cries echoing through the Drakwald forest. The march toward the Rift Axe had begun, and the blood-soaked path to Chaos Ascension lay before them. Theo frowned at the crowd, taking in their stances and motions, and trying to highlight the different materials that he could see. Chapter 3. The Relic's Lore. The warband huddled around the dying embers of a campfire deep within the Drakwald forest. The flickering flames cast long, jagged shadows across the clearing, their shapes shifting like the chaos-tainted minds of those who sat nearby. Kael Bloodfang stood at the center, his massive frame illuminated by the firelight, his crimson fur and jagged horns lending him the aura of a predator ready to strike. "Why?" The man looked surprised and enfrightened. Chakra the Bray shaman crouched nearby, his wiry form draped in tattered robes, adorned with fetishes of bone, hair, and Wordstone shards. The gleaming baubles clattered softly as he stirred a bowl of viscous black liquid that shimmered unnaturally. His glowing slit-pupil eyes darted upward as Kael's burning voice cut through the stillness. "Speak, Chakra, tell us of the relic. Kael growled, his claws flexing impatiently. The warband gathered closer, their monstrous forms casting grotesque silhouettes in the firelight. Garroch Ironhorn loomed behind Kael, the massive Doombal's breath steaming in the cool night air as he sharpened his colossal great axe. Skrinath, the shadowy Angor, lingered at the edge of the light, his sharp eyes darting to and fro as though watching for unseen threats. Ulgar Bonegrinder, the enslaved troll, sat muttering incoherently, chewing on a discarded limb from a recent kill. Chakra leaned forward, his gnarled fingers dipping into the dark liquid. He traced chaotic symbols in the dirt, each line glowing faintly as if infused with the winds of magic. His voice was a rasping hiss, thick with malice and reverence. "The gods have shown me the truth," he began. "The relic is no ordinary weapon. It is a shard of chaos itself, a thing of infinite power forged in the fires of the warp. They call it the Rift Axe, a blade that can cleave the veil between realms and twist reality to the wielder's will." A murmur of awe rippled through the warband. Even Garroch paused his sharpening, his beady eyes narrowing as he regarded Chakra. "However—" "What do you mean, twist reality?" Skrinath asked, his voice a sharp hiss. His wiry frame remained tense, as if ready to bolt at any moment. Chakra grinned, his jagged teeth glinting in the firelight. "The Rift Axe bends the laws of the world. A single swing can turn the sky to blood, the earth to ash. It is said that the one who wields it is no longer bound by mortal limits. With such power, Beastlord," he turned his gaze to Kael, his grin widening, "you would become the avatar of chaos, the master of all Drakwald." Kael's crimson eyes burned brighter, the image of the relic from his vision surging to the forefront of his mind. The power it promised was intoxicating, irresistible. His skin prickled with the need to find out if the relic had... "Where is it?" he demanded, his voice a guttural growl that silenced the others. "On a shelf." Chakra paused, his claw tracing another glowing rune in the dirt. "The relic lies in the heart of the Blackhorn warherds' domain. Their herdstone is ancient and mighty, its runes etched with blood and fire over centuries. Lord Maldr the Defiler holds the Rift Axe in his grasp." The name sent a ripple of tension through the warband. Garroch snorted, steam rising from his flared nostrils. Skrinath shifted uneasily, his dark eyes narrowing. Even Ulgar stopped chewing, his dim gaze locking onto Chakra. "Maldr," Garroch rumbled, his deep voice like grinding stone. "I have heard of him. A brute, even by our kind's standards. His warherd is massive, his minotaurs legion. He will not give up the relic easily." "Oh!" Chakra chuckled darkly. "Of course not, but that is why we are here. The gods have chosen Kael to claim the Rift Axe. Maldr's strength is no match for their will." Kael's claws scraped against the handle of his axe, his mind racing with thoughts of conquest and bloodshed. "The Blackhorns will fall," he declared. "I will rip the Rift Axe from Maldr's hands myself. His warherd will kneel or die." Skrinath edged closer, his thin lips curling into a sly grin. "And if the relic is as powerful as you say, it will not just be the Drakwald we claim. The other forests, the Empire's cities, all will burn before us." Kael turned to his warband, his eyes burning with the fire of ambition. "Prepare yourselves. We march at first light. The Blackhorns will know the fury of the Bloodclaw, and the Rift Axe will be mine." The warband brayed in savage approval, the firelight reflecting off their wicked weapons and twisted forms. Chakra chuckled to himself, his mind already plotting how he might turn the relic to his own advantage. Garrick ground his axe against a stone, his muscles flexing as he prepared for the bloodshed to come. Skrinath faded into the shadows, eager to scout ahead and map the path to the Blackhorn territory. As Kael stood before them, his towering form wreathed in firelight and shadow, the weight of destiny pressed upon him. The Chaos Gods had chosen him, and he would not fail them. The Drakwald would be his, and the Rift Axe would be the key to his ascension. Chapter 4. Into the Wilds. The Drakwald forest was a nightmare made flesh, a labyrinth of shadow and decay that seemed to shift and twist around those who dared to enter. The deeper Kael Bloodfang's warband ventured, the more the forest seemed to close in on them, its gnarled branches reaching out like skeletal fingers, its thick mist clinging to their fur and armor. The air was heavy with the scent of rot and the faint metallic tang of chaos magic. Kael led the way, his hulking frame a silhouette against the dim light that filtered through the canopy. Behind him marched his warband, their savage forms blending into the gloom. Garrick Ironhorn's massive hooves cracked the brittle undergrowth with every step, his snorting breaths bogging the air. Skrinath darted from shadow to shadow, his sharp eyes scanning for threats, his staff crackling faintly with dark energy. Even Olgar Bonegrinder, the dim-witted troll, lumbered along in eerie silence, his massive fists dragging through the dirt. The forest was alive with sound. The rustling of unseen creatures, the distant howls of beasts, and the occasional cracking of branches that seemed to echo far too loudly. Every sound set the warband on edge, their weapons drawn and ready. It was Skrinath who first sensed the danger. The Ungor stopped suddenly, his nostrils flaring as he sniffed the air. His black eyes darted to the twisted trees ahead, their roots coiling unnaturally, like the legs of a crouched predator. "Something's watching us," he hissed, his voice barely audible over the oppressive silence. Kael growled low in his throat, his crimson eyes scanning the darkness. "Show yourselves, cowards," he roared, his voice echoing through the trees. The challenge hung in the air, unanswered. He heard a slight tremor of fear in the trees. Then came the first strike. A skittering sound erupted from the canopy above, followed by a scream as one of the Ungors at the rear of the warband was yanked into the darkness. His cry was cut short with a sickening crunch. The others whirled, weapons drawn, but the mist and shadows revealed nothing. The attack came from all sides. Massive spiders, their chitinous bodies glistening with venom, burst from the underbrush and descended from the trees on silken threads. Each was the size of a warhorse, their legs moving with eerie precision as they lunged at the warband. Kael's axe cleaved through the first spider that leapt at him, splitting its body in two with a wet, satisfying crunch. Black ichor sprayed across the Beastlord's fur, but he barely noticed, turning to face the next attacker. Garrock roared, his bellow shaking the very trees, and swung his great axe in a wide arc. The blade sheared through the legs of two spiders, sending their twitching bodies crashing to the ground. One managed to sink its fangs into his armored shoulder, but Garrock shrugged it off, his brute strength smashing the creature into a tree. Garrock turned to Gagrono. Skrinath darted through the chaos, his smaller size allowing him to evade the spider's clumsy strikes. His twin daggers flashed in the dim light, stabbing into soft joints and underbellies. Each kill was quick and efficient, but his sharp eyes remained wary for more. Chakra raised his staff, the runes along its length glowing with malevolent energy. A surge of dark magic erupted from its tip, searing a spider in midair. The creature shrieked as it disintegrated into ash, but the Bray shaman's spell seemed to enrage the others. They turned on him, their many eyes reflecting the flickering green light of his staff. Thoreau bit his tongue. "Protect the shaman," Kael roared, hacking through a spider that tried to flank him. Olgar, oblivious to the chaos around him, finally entered the fray. The troll grabbed a spider by its legs, swinging it like a crude club to batter another. The sickening crack of exoskeletons breaking under his immense strength was punctuated by his guttural laughter. Despite their strength and savagery, the spiders' numbers were overwhelming. For every one they killed, another seemed to emerge from the shadows. The warband began to falter, their ranks growing disorganized. Kael knew they needed to break the swarm's momentum. With a roar that silenced even the spiders, he raised his axe high and charged into the thickest cluster of the creatures. His strikes were a blur of motion, severing legs and crushing bodies with unrelenting ferocity. He battled them out of existence with force they did not accept. The warband, inspired by their leader's display, rallied. Garruk bellowed his own challenge and charged alongside Kael, while Skrinath struck from the shadows with deadly precision. Chakra unleashed another wave of dark magic, sending spiders fleeing in fear. Even Olgar, mindless as he was, seemed to gain focus, smashing and stomping with wild abandon. Finally, the tide began to turn. The spiders, realizing they could not overwhelm the warband, retreated into the shadows, their skittering legs fading into the distance. The clearing fell silent once more, save for the ragged breaths of the warband. Kael stood in the center, his crimson fur slick with spider ichor, his axe dripping black. He surveyed his warriors, noting their injuries but also their resolve. "Is this all the forest has to offer?" he growled, his voice carrying the weight of triumph. "Pathetic." Chakra stepped forward, leaning heavily on his staff. "The forest will not yield easily, Beastlord. This was but the beginning." Kael snorted, his fiery eyes narrowing. "Let it sin whatever it wishes. We will carve a path of blood to the Blackhorns." The warband brayed in agreement, their savage cries echoing through the trees. Despite the ambush, their unity had held. Their resolve was unshaken. They were the Bloodclaw, and nothing would stop them from claiming the Rift Axe. As they moved deeper into the Drakwald, the forest watched, silent and patient. It was not done with them yet. Chapter 5. First Blood. The twisted trees of the Drakwald forest began to thin, giving way to rocky outcroppings and open clearings strewn with bones and decaying carcasses. The signs were unmistakable. They had reached the outskirts of Blackhorn territory. The scent of rival beastmen hung heavy in the air, mingling with the ever-present stench of rot and chaos. Kael Bloodfang led his warband through the desolate expanse, his crimson eyes scanning for movement. His warriors followed closely, their weapons at the ready. Garruk Ironhorn snorted, his massive frame tense with anticipation. Skrinath flitted between shadows, his daggers gleaming faintly. Even Ulgar Bonegrinder seemed more alert, his dim gaze shifting toward the horizon, as if sensing the violence to come. It wasn't long before their presence was noticed. A guttural horn blast shattered the forest's uneasy silence. Kael halted, raising a claw to signal his warband. The sound echoed through the trees, and moments later, figures began to emerge from the shadows, hulking, brutish forms with jagged weapons and wicked snarls. The rival warband was smaller than Kael's, but no less fearsome. At its head stood a black-furred Beastlord, his curved horns adorned with blood-stained fetishes. His name was Rorgath the Unyielding, a chieftain of the Blackhorn warherd, tasked with guarding the borders of their domain. "It's a valiant act in this war," he told the crowd. Kael stepped forward, his massive axe resting on his shoulder. The two Beastlords locked eyes, their mutual hatred palpable. "Rorgath," Kael growled, his voice dripping with contempt. "Step aside and spare your warband. I have no time to waste on weaklings." Rorgath bared his fangs in a savage grin, his clawed hands tightening around a barbed spear. "Weaklings? You trespass on Blackhorn lands, Bloodfang. Your warband will feed the crows, and your skull will decorate our herdstone." Kael's lips curled into a snarl. "So be it." He sighed, then screamed. With a roar, the two warbands clashed. The clearing erupted into chaos as beastmen tore into one another with savage fury. Kael surged forward, his axe swinging in wide arcs that sent limbs and blood spraying through the air. The first foe to challenge him, a snarling Gore wielding a crude mace, was cut down in a single strike, his torso cleaved in two. Kael didn't pause, already seeking his next victim. Garrick roared as he waded into the fray, his massive great axe carving through multiple foes with each swing. The Domble was a whirlwind of destruction, his thick hide shrugging off blows that would fell lesser warriors. His bellowing laughter echoed through the clearing as he crushed a rival minotaur beneath his hooves. Skrenath darted through the melee, his twin daggers finding soft spots between armor and fur. He moved like a shadow, striking and vanishing before his enemies could retaliate. One Ungor tried to flank him, but Skrenath spun and plunged both blades into the creature's throat, silencing his gurgled cries. Chakra stood at the edge of the battlefield, his staff glowing with dark energy. He chanted guttural incantations, summoning tendrils of green fire that lashed out at the enemy. The flames clung to their targets, reducing flesh and bone to ash. Each spell left Chakra visibly drained, but his malevolent grin never wavered. Ulgar, as unpredictable as ever, charged into the thickest cluster of enemies, swinging a massive tree trunk like a club. Rival beastmen were sent flying, their bodies broken and twisted. The troll roared in mindless glee, swatting aside those foolish enough to challenge him. Kael's gaze locked onto Rorgath, who stood at the center of the rival warband, spearing one of Kael's warriors through the chest. The black-furred Beastlord bellowed a challenge, and Kael answered with a thunderous roar. Nico held his breath. The two collided with a force that shook the ground. Rorgath's spear thrust toward Kael's chest, but the blood-clawed Beastlord sidestepped, his axe lashing out in a counterstrike. The blade glanced off Rorgath's armor, leaving a jagged gash. Rorgath snarled and swung his spear in a wide arc, the barbed tip aimed for Kael's throat. Kael ducked, closing the distance with a brutal shoulder charge that sent Rorgath staggering back. Wasting no time, Kael brought his axe down in a savage overhead strike. Rorgath barely managed to block with the haft of his spear, but the force of the blow shattered the weapon. With a roar of desperation, Rorgath lunged at Kael, his claws slashing at the Bloodlord's face. Kael roared in fury as the claws raked his cheek, blood staining his crimson fur. He retaliated with a headbutt, his jagged horns driving into Rorgath's skull. The rival Beastlord reeled, dazed and vulnerable. Kael seized the moment. His axe arced through the air, the blade biting deep into Rorgath's chest. The black-furred Beastlord staggered, blood pouring from the massive wound. Kael kicked him to the ground, planting a hoof on his chest. "You were warned," Kael snarled, raising his axe for the killing blow. "Now you will serve as an example." With a single savage swing, Kael's axe cleaved Rorgath's head from his shoulders. The rival warband faltered, their will broken at the sight of their fallen leader. Kael raised Rorgath's severed head high, his blood-soaked fur gleaming in the dim light. "This is the fate of all who defy the Blood Claw," he bellowed. The remaining Blackhorn warriors fled into the forest, their brays of terror fading into the distance. Kael's warband erupted into savage cheers, their morale bolstered by their leader's dominance. As the blood-soaked Beastlord surveyed the battlefield, his crimson eyes burned with triumph. The first blood had been spilled, and the path to the Rift Axe was now wide open. A chorus of shouting emotions filled the promenade. If it weren't a single sex safe, who knew how many troops of horned statues might be there? Chapter 6. The Wordstone Pool. The air grew colder as the warband ventured deeper into the Drakwald forest. The dense canopy above blotted out the chaos moon, Morsleeb, casting the forest floor into an eerie, perpetual twilight. The once familiar brays and howls of distant creatures fell silent, replaced by an oppressive stillness. Something was wrong here, something ancient and corrupted. Chakra the Bray shaman halted abruptly, his slit-pupiled eyes narrowing as his twisted staff began to tremble faintly in his grasp. The weird stone charms dangling from its tip clattered against each other, reacting to an unseen force. "Do you feel it?" he hissed, his voice a rasping whisper. "The forest breathes differently here." Kael Bloodfang, towering above the rest of the warband, turned his crimson eyes on Chakra. "What is it, sorcerer?" he growled. "Speak plainly, or I'll feed you to the troll." Chakra grinned, his jagged teeth glinting in the dim light. "Wordstone," he said, a note of reverence in his voice. "Chaos incarnate, seeping into the land itself. There is a pool nearby, steeped in its power." Kael snorted, his clawed hand tightening on the haft of his axe. "Lead the way. If the gods have left their gifts here, we will take them." The tainted pool. The warband followed Chakra through the labyrinthine forest until they came upon a clearing. At its center lay a small pool of water, its surface unnaturally still and glowing faintly with a sickly green light. Jagged shards of Wordstone jutted from the surrounding earth, like the teeth of some immense buried beast. The air around the pool shimmered with an otherworldly energy, and the scent of decay and ozone filled their nostrils. Chakra stepped forward, his clawed fingers reaching out toward the pool. "Magnificent," he murmured. "The winds of chaos flow through this place. Its power is pure, untamed." Kael's crimson eyes narrowed as he regarded the pool. "What can it do, sorcerer? Speak plainly." "But..." Chakra turned to him, his grin widening. "It can make us stronger. The Wordstone's essence can be harvested, channeled into weapons, armor, and flesh." The warband brayed in approval, but Kael silenced them with a raised claw. "Do it then," he commanded. "Take its power, but be quick. We have little time to waste." The harvest. Chakra raised his staff, the runes along its length glowing as he began to chant. The weird stone around the pool pulsed in response, and the green light of the water grew brighter. The winds of chaos swirled around the clearing, lifting debris and howling through the warped trees. Chakra's voice grew louder, more guttural, as he wove the pool's energy into his spell. But as the power of the Wordstone was drawn into Chakra's staff, the pool began to bubble and churn. The ground beneath the warband trembled, and the energy in the air became almost unbearable. One of the warriors, a towering Gore named Murgash, stepped too close to the pool. The green light enveloped him, and he let out a blood-curdling scream. The warband watched in horror as Murgash's body twisted and contorted, his muscles bulging grotesquely and his fur falling away in patches. His horns elongated into jagged spires, and his claws grew into monstrous talons. His eyes glowed with an unholy light as he turned on his comrades, his once loyal brays replaced by guttural roars of madness. Chaos unleashed. Murgash lunged at the nearest warrior, tearing through armor and flesh with terrifying ease. The warband erupted into chaos as they fought to subdue their mutated comrade. Skrinath, ever quick on his feet, darted in and out of the fray, his daggers slashing at Murgash's exposed flesh. "He's lost to the Wordstone," Skrinath shouted. "Kill him before he takes us all." Korvek, the hulking Bestigor, charged forward with his great axe, his bellow shaking the clearing. He swung with all his might, but Murgash caught the blade with his talons, snapping it in half as if it were a twig. The mutated Gore let out a deafening roar, throwing Korvek to the ground. "Exile inunt imprexinit. It's a priceless tool for avenging the offenses of your foes," whispered Murgash. Kael roared, raising his axe high. "Enough! This ends now!" He charged Murgash, the rift axe glowing with unholy energy. Their clash was brutal, the corrupted Gore's newfound strength matching Kael's ferocity, blow for blow. But the rift axe's power was too great. With a final, devastating strike, Kael cleaved Murgash in two, the green glow in his eyes fading as his body crumpled to the ground. The aftermath. The clearing fell silent, save for the crackling energy of the pool and the heavy breathing of the survivors. Chakra stepped forward, his grin now tinged with unease. "The Wordstone's power is not to be trifled with," he said, his voice low. "It is both a gift and a curse." Kael turned to him, his fiery eyes blazing. "You knew this would happen," he growled. "You knew it could corrupt us." Chakra bowed his head slightly, his grin never faltering. "The gods demand sacrifice, Beastlord, even in victory." Kael's claws tightened on his axe, but he did not strike. Instead, he turned to the warband. "This is the power we face," he said, his voice booming. "The gods test us at every turn. If you are weak, you will fall. If you are strong, you will rise. Prove your strength, or die." The warband brayed in uneasy agreement, their fear of Kael outweighing their doubts. They gathered their weapons and prepared to move on, leaving the tainted pool behind. But the memory of Murgash's fate lingered in their minds, a stark reminder of the dangers they faced in the pursuit of chaos. As the warband marched deeper into the Drakwald, the Wordstone's glow faded, its power spent. For now. Chapter 7. Echoes of Chaos. The Draken forest had never felt so alive. The gnarled trees seemed to whisper, their twisted branches creaking with a language that only Kael Bloodfang could hear. Shadows danced unnaturally in the dim light of Morsleb, flickering as though alive. The air was thick with the scent of decay and blood, but Kael found it intoxicating. It was as though the forest itself was breathing, its essence entwining with his own. Kael stood apart from the warband, his massive frame illuminated by the faint glow of the rift axe. The weapon had grown heavier in his claws, its pulsing lights seeming to match the erratic rhythm of his heart. He stared at its jagged edge, watching the swirling energy within, and felt the pull of something far greater than himself. The whispers began again, soft at first, like a faint breeze brushing against his mind. Then they grew louder, their guttural voices weaving a tapestry of madness that only he could understand. "Open the doors," the man said. The whispers began again. The whispers began to intensify, and the doors appeared. These whispers began again, swelling to the kind of loudness that horror poets have created. Bloodfang, chosen of chaos, The forest bows to your will. But greater trials await. Blood must flow. Death must come. Power must grow. Kael's crimson eyes blazed brighter as the whispers surged. Images flooded his mind, visions of slaughter and glory. He saw himself atop a mountain of corpses, the rift axe raised high as the forest burned around him. He saw cities reduced to rubble, rivers running red with blood, and legions of beastmen kneeling before him in worship. Anger burned within them, but there was more. The visions twisted and shifted, showing glimpses of otherworldly landscapes, the boiling skies of the realm of chaos, where time and space bent under the will of the gods. He saw his own form, monstrous and godlike, his body warped by power, his laughter echoing through eternity. Kael gripped the axe tighter, his breath ragged. The power the chaos gods promised was within his grasp, but the price of such power clawed at the edges of his sanity. He was preparing for an unexpected tragedy like this so many times. The Warband's unease. The Warband watched from a distance, their fear growing with each passing day. Kael's connection to the rift axe had deepened, but so had his unpredictability. His crimson fur was streaked with black veins that pulsed faintly in the dim light, and his fiery eyes burned with an intensity that made even the bravest among them avert their gaze. Skrinath, the shadowy Ungor, observed Kael with suspicion. "He's not the same," he muttered to Korvek, the hulking Bestigor. "The axe, it's changing him, warping him." Korvek snorted, his massive arms crossed. "He's stronger than ever. The gods favor him." "Favor him," Skrinath snapped, his voice low but sharp. "Or are they using him? Look at him, Korvek. Look at what he's becoming." Korvek glanced toward Kael, who now paced before the Herdstone, his movements erratic, his claws twitching as though he was fighting an unseen foe. Even the Bestigar couldn't deny the truth. Kael's connection to chaos was growing stronger, but at a cost none of them could understand. Visions of savagery. That night, as the Warband rested in the shadow of the Herdstone, Kael's visions returned. This time they were more vivid, more consuming. The whispers rose to a deafening roar, and the images seared themselves into his mind. He saw the rift axe not as a weapon, but as a key, a conduit to ultimate power. The chaos gods demanded more blood, more death, more suffering, and they had chosen Kael to deliver it. Kael fell to his knees, clutching his head, as the visions overwhelmed him. He roared in agony, the sound reverberating through the forest. His warriors woke, their eyes wide with fear as they watched their Beastlord writhe in the grip of chaos. The forest seemed to respond to Kael's torment. The trees groaned, their branches twisting toward him as if in supplication. The ground trembled, and the faint glow of the rift axe illuminated the clearing in an eerie, unholy light. Kael rose, his body trembling, but his eyes burning with newfound resolve. The whispers faded, replaced by a singular clarity. The chaos gods had spoken, and their will was absolute. The Warband's fear. The Warband gathered before Kael, their unease palpable. Skrinath's sharp eyes darted nervously to the others, while Korvek stood firm, though even he couldn't hide the tension in his stance. Ulgar Bonegrinder, the massive troll, growled low in his throat, his dim mind unable to grasp the situation, but sensing the growing danger nonetheless. Kael raised the rift axe, its glow casting long shadows across his warriors. "The gods have spoken," he bellowed, his voice resonating with unnatural power. "They demand blood. They demand conquest. We are their chosen, and we will bring ruin to all who stand before us." The warband brayed weakly in response, their voices lacking the fervor they had once held. They could see the changes in Kael, his erratic movements, his sudden bursts of rage, the way his fiery eyes seemed to burn too brightly. His power was undeniable, but it was clear that chaos was consuming him. Skrinath stepped forward cautiously, his voice low but steady. "Beastlord, the warband will follow you to the ends of the Drakwald. But are you certain the gods favor this path?" Kael turned his blazing eyes on the Ungor, his lips curling into a snarl. "Do you question the will of the gods, Skrinath? Do you doubt my strength?" Skrinath flinched but held his ground. "No, Beastlord. But the warband, they are afraid." Kael's snarl turned into a cruel grin. "Good. Fear makes them stronger, and if they falter, I will cull the weak myself." Descent into madness. As the warband prepared to march deeper into the forest, Kael's connection to the Rift Axe continued to deepen. The whispers of the Chaos Gods grew louder, their demands more insistent. The visions of blood and fire consumed his thoughts, driving him to greater heights of savagery. But with every step, the warband grew more divided. Skrinath and a few others whispered among themselves, their loyalty wavering as they watched their Beastlords slip further into madness. Korvac remained steadfast, but even he began to question whether Kael's strength was leading them to glory or destruction. Kael stood at the edge of the clearing, the rift axe glowing in his claws, his crimson eyes fixed on the horizon. The Chaos Gods had chosen him, and he would not fail them. But deep within his mind, a shadow of doubt lingered, a faint echo of the man he had once been, now lost to the power of chaos. The warband marched onward, their path lit by the eerie glow of the rift axe. The Drakwald whispered around them, its ancient voice mingling with the laughter of the Chaos Gods. Kael's ascension had begun, but the cost of his power was yet to be paid. Chapter 8. The Lost Herdstone. The Drakwald forest seemed darker and more foreboding as the warband pressed forward. The air grew thick with a chilling stillness, and even the rustle of leaves and distant howls of unseen predators had vanished. The rift axe in Kael Bloodfang's grasp pulsed faintly, its glow cutting through the oppressive gloom like a sinister beacon. Chakra's voice echoed in Carol's mind, a memory of the fallen Bray shaman's cryptic words. "The old Herdstones hold power, even when abandoned. Their essence lingers, waiting for those strong enough to claim it." Kael's crimson eyes scanned the horizon until the object of their search came into view. The Herdstone stood alone in a desolate clearing, its jagged black surface cracked and weathered by centuries of neglect. Faint runes carved into its surface still glowed dimly, flickering as though on the verge of fading out entirely. The clearing was littered with ancient bones, rusted weapons, and the rotted remnants of past sacrifices. Korvac, the hulking Bestiger, snorted, his breath steaming in the chill air. "This place feels wrong," he growled, his massive great axe resting on his shoulder. "There's something watching." Skrinath, ever alert, crouched low, his sharp eyes darting toward the shadows. "He's right. I can feel it too. We're not alone." Kael stepped forward, his clawed feet crunching against the brittle ground. "We'll take what remains of its power," he growled. "But be ready. The gods demand blood, and this place has plenty left to give." Spectral guardians. As the warband approached the Herdstone, the air around them grew colder, their breaths forming clouds of mist. A low, mournful bray echoed through the clearing, rising into a cacophony of wails. The ground trembled, and from the shadows emerged the guardians of the abandoned Herdstone. Spectral beastmen materialized, their ghostly forms flickering with an eerie, greenish light. They were twisted echoes of a long-dead warherd, their hollow eyes burning with hatred. Each carried ethereal weapons, their forms shifting and writhing, as though caught between this world and the next. The warband tensed as the spirits advanced, their movements unnatural and jerky. Kael raised the rift axe, its glow flaring brighter in response to the spectral presence. "Bound to the stone," Kael growled, his voice booming. "Destroy them, and the Herdstone will be ours." With a roar, the warband charged. The clash between the living and the spectral was unlike any the warband had faced before. The spectral beastmen moved with supernatural speed, their ethereal weapons passing through flesh and armor alike, sapping the life force of those they struck. Korvek met one of the spirits head-on, his great axe cleaving through its flickering form. But instead of dissipating, the ghostly beastman reformed, its hollow eyes glowing brighter as it swung a jagged sword at Korvek's chest. The Bestigar roared in pain, staggering back as the spectral blade passed through his armor, leaving no visible wound but sapping his strength. "Ekel Palma's broken accoutions," he said tersely. Skrinath darted through the chaos, his daggers flashing as he struck at the spirits. "We can't fight them like this," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the wailing spirits. "They're tied to the Herdstone." Kael roared as he swung the rift axe, the weapon's unholy energy slicing through two spirits in a single blow. Unlike the others, the spirits destroyed by the rift axe did not reform, their flickering forms dissipating into nothingness. Kael grinned savagely. "The axe is the key," he growled. "Protect me while I destroy the stone." Breaking the stone, Kael charged toward the Herdstone, his warband struggling to hold back the spectral onslaught. Korvek fought valiantly, his massive frame a bulwark against the tide of ghosts, but the toll on his body was evident. Grinath flitted through the battle, his agility allowing him to evade the worst of the attacks. But even he knew their efforts were a delaying tactic at best. Kael reached the base of the Herdstone, its surface glowing faintly as the spirits drew strength from it. He raised the rift axe high, its unholy light blazing brighter than ever. With a roar, he brought the axe down, its jagged edge biting deep into the stone. His most promising customer accepted the offer of work. Go further, beat stronger, be stronger. The Herdstone shuddered, cracks spidering out from the point of impact. The wails of the spectral beastmen grew louder, their forms flickering erratically. Kael struck again and again, each blow shaking the ground and weakening the stone's connection to its ghostly guardians. The spirits turned their focus to Kael, their hollow eyes blazing with fury. They surged toward him, but Korvek and Skrinath intercepted them, their combined efforts holding the line. "Finish it, Beastlord," Skrinath shouted, his daggers flashing as he fought off the spectral tide. With a final thunderous blow, Kael shattered the Herdstone. The stone exploded in a blinding burst of green light, its energy surging outward and obliterating the spectral beastmen in an instant. The clearing fell silent, the oppressive chill dissipating as the remnants of the Herdstone crumbled into dust. Laboring the essence, Kael stood amidst the rubble, the rift axe glowing faintly in his claws. He could feel the power of the Herdstone flowing into him, its lingering chaos energy bolstering his strength. The warband gathered around him, their bodies battered but their loyalty reaffirmed by his victory. Korvek, his breath ragged, approached Kael. "The Herdstone's power is yours, Beastlord. What now?" Kael turned his blazing eyes on the Bestigar, his lips curling into a savage grin. "We march," he growled. "The gods have blessed us with their gifts. but there is more blood to be spilled. This is only for the beginning." The warband brayed in approval, their spirits lifted by the triumph. As they prepared to leave the clearing, the shadows of the Drakwald seemed to recede, as though the forest itself acknowledged Kael's dominance. But the Chaos Gods were never satisfied. Kael knew that this victory was only a step toward the greater trials to come. The rift axe pulsed in his claws, its unholy light a reminder of the power he had claimed, and the price he would eventually pay. Chapter 9. Maldr's Hunters. The warband marched in grim silence, the oppressive shadows of the Drakwald forest swallowing their forms. The defeat of the spectral beastmen at the Lost Herdstone had emboldened Kael Bloodfang's warriors, but there was no respite in the chaos-tainted woodlands. They were deep within Blackhorn territory now, and the threat of reprisal loomed like a blade poised to strike. Trunhad, the wiry Ungor, darted ahead of the group, his sharp senses attuned to the slightest disturbance. He moved like a wraith through the undergrowth, his dagger drawn and ready. The forest was alive with muted sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant howl of a beast. But there was something else. A faint, rhythmic cadence, like the tread of disciplined hooves. Kael's crimson eyes narrowed as Skrenath slipped back into the group, his lean form barely visible in the gloom. Shoestring boundaries, no obvious paths. "They're close," Skrenath hissed, his voice barely audible. "At least a dozen. They're moving like predators, controlled, careful." Maldr's elite. Vin slowly described the scene, showing the outline of Skrenath's elite. Ael snarled, his claws tightening on the haft of his axe. The Blackhorns would not send such hunters, unless they saw Kael's warband as a true threat. That realization only fueled his determination. "Will not be stalked like prey," Kael growled. His gaze swept over his warriors, their savage forms bristling with anticipation. "Skrenath, can you lead them into a trap?" The Unger's lips curled into a sly grin. "Easily. They think they're hunting us, but they won't know what hit them." Kael nodded. "Do it. Garrick, Chakra, Olga, prepare yourselves. When they spring the trap, leave no survivors." The warband scattered into position, following Skrenath's plan. Kael and the bulk of his warriors feigned retreat, moving slowly through the forest and leaving an obvious trail of broken branches and disturbed earth. Skrenath, meanwhile, doubled back, his sharp eyes and ears attuned to the hunter's approach. It wasn't long before he spotted them. The Blackhorn hunters moved with deadly precision, their forms blending into the forest shadows. Each one was a hardened warrior, their bodies adorned with trophies from past kills. At their head was a massive Gor with black fur and golden horns, his cruel eyes scanning the trail with practiced ease. Skrenath recognized him. Rhaegar the Fang, one of Maldr's most trusted lieutenants. Skrenath's grin widened. The fools were walking right into their doom. The ambush began with a roar. As Rhaegar and his hunters followed the trail into a narrow clearing, Chakra unleashed the first strike. From his hidden position, the Bray shaman thrust his staff skyward, summoning a surge of green fire that erupted in the midst of the hunters. Two were engulfed instantly, their shrieks echoing through the forest as the chaos flames reduced them to ash. Kael's warband erupted from the underbrush, their savage war cries drowning out the hunters' momentary confusion. Kael himself led the charge, his axe carving a brutal path through the nearest foes. The first hunter to challenge him, a heavily armored Vestigor, was split from shoulder to hip in a single devastating strike. Garrick Ironhorn followed close behind, his great axe cleaving through multiple enemies with each swing. The Doomball's bellow shook the trees, his immense strength scattering the hunters like leaves in a storm. One of the Blackhorns tried to flank him, but Garrick's massive hoof caught the warrior mid-stride, shattering bone and ending the threat. Olgar Bonegrinder, oblivious to the chaos around him, smashed his way through the enemy lines with mindless glee. The Troll's makeshift club, a tree trunk still dripping with sap, crushed bodies and broke bones with sickening ease. Despite the wounds he sustained, Olgar's regenerative abilities kept him in the fight, his laughter ringing out like a warped bell. Rhaegar roared, rallying his hunters with savage commands. "Hold the line! Kill the shaman! Zelan have mercy!" The Blackhorns regrouped, their disciplined counterattack targeting Shakra, who stood at the edge of the battlefield weaving spells. Before they could reach him, however, Skrenath struck. The Ungor emerged from the shadows behind the enemy line, his daggers flashing. One hunter fell without a sound, Skrenath's blade finding his throat. Another turned too late, his screams silenced as Skrenath plunged his weapon into his spine. Kael's roar drew all eyes back to the center of the fray. The Beastlord stood over a pile of corpses, his axe dripping with gore. His crimson fur gleamed in the dim light, his eyes burning with unholy fury. He charged Rhaegar, their clash shaking the ground as axe met spear. Rhaegar fought with savage precision, his spear thrusting and slashing in a blur of motion. But Kael was relentless, his strikes driven by the will of the Chaos Gods. The fight ended when Kael caught the spear mid-thrust, snapping it in two with his claws. Before Rhaegar could react, Kael's axe arced downward, cleaving through his skull and splitting his body in half. With their leader dead, the remaining hunters broke, their discipline shattered. Kael's warband gave chase, cutting them down as they fled into the forest. The clearing fell silent once more, save for the ragged breaths of the victors. Kael stood over Rhaegar's broken body, his crimson eyes blazing. "Maldr will learn of this," he growled. "He will know the strength of the Bloodclaw." Chakra approached, his staff still glowing faintly. "The Blackhorns will not forgive this insult. They will come for us." Gale smirked, his bloodied fangs glinting in the dim light. "Let them. Each one that falls brings us closer to the Rift Axe." Roared the Warband Bray in savage approval, their morale bolstered by their victory. They had faced Maldr's elite and triumphed, their unity and strength unbroken. The path to the Rift Axe was clearer now, though they knew the Blackhorns would not let this humiliation go unanswered. Kael turned to his warriors, his voice booming across the battlefield. "We march at dawn. The gods demand blood, and we will give it to them." As the warband gathered their weapons and trophies, the Drakwald watched, silent and brooding. The Chaos Gods were pleased, and the hunt for the Rift Axe continued. Chapter 10. Betrayal Among Beasts. The warband made camp beneath a canopy of warped and gnarled trees, their blackened branches twisting like claws against the dim glow of Marsley, the Chaos Moon. The stench of blood and ichor lingered in the air after the battle with Maldr's hunters, a macabre reminder of their brutal victory. The warriors of the Bloodclaw warherd feasted on the spoils of their triumph, gnawing on raw flesh and howling into the night. Kael Bloodfang sat apart from the others, his massive frame casting a looming shadow over the clearing. His crimson eyes burned with an unholy light as he sharpened the jagged edge of his axe. Around him, the warband brayed and bellowed in savage revelry, but Kael's focus remained sharp. Victory was never the end. It was only the next step in the path of chaos. Not everyone shared his vision. Garruk Ironhorn, the hulking Denbull, stood near the edge of the camp, his massive great axe leaning against his shoulder. The glow of the campfire reflected off his dark, furred hide, and his small, cruel eyes were fixed on Kael. The Beastlord's growing power and authority gnawed at him like a festering wound. Garrock had long believed himself the mightiest of the Blood Claw, and Kael's dominance stoked the fires of his envy. Misery. The Doombull's deep, gravelly voice rumbled through the camp. Why should we follow you, Kael? You lead us deeper into Blackhorn lands, into endless battles. For what? A relic that only you will wield. The camp grew silent. The warriors of the Warband turned to watch, their savage faces alight with anticipation. The challenge among beastmen was no rare thing, but it was always bloody, and it always left the herd changed. Many times had I walked in the mountains where Charles and I had glanced up at the sky. Kael's lips curled into a snarl. He rose to his full height, his crimson fur glinting in the firelight. His axe rested easily in his clawed hand, its jagged edge gleaming. Nikke's eyes lowered. "Careful, Garrock," Kael growled, his voice low and menacing. "Are you questioning the will of the gods, or is it my strength you doubt?" Garrock stepped forward, his massive hooves cracking the brittle underbrush. His great axe gleamed wickedly in the firelight. "The gods demand strength," he rumbled. "But you lead with words, Kael. Let us see if your strength is worthy." Kael's grin widened, baring his blood-stained fangs. "You want to challenge me, Garrock? So be it. Come, and I'll show you what happens to those who defy the Beastlord." The Warband formed a wide circle around the two rivals, their savage brays and howls building into a frenzied chant. The air was electric with bloodlust and anticipation. Kael and Garrock stood at the center, two titans of muscle and fury, their weapons raised and their eyes locked. With a thunderous roar, Garrock struck first. His great axe swung in a wide arc, its sheer weight enough to crush a lesser warrior. Kael sidestepped with lightning speed, the blade missing him by inches. He countered with a vicious swing of his own, his axe aiming for Garrock's exposed flank. Dumbull twisted, blocking the strike with the haft of his weapon. The clash of metal on metal rang out like a thunderclap. Garrock roared and charged, his horns lowered like a battering ram. Kael met the charge head-on, his own horns locking with Garrock's in a brutal contest of strength. The ground trembled beneath their hooves as they grappled, each straining to overpower the other. Garrock's brute force began to push Kael back, his hooves digging deep into the dirt. But Kael's crimson eyes burned brighter, and with a savage twist, he broke free, swinging his axe in a tight arc. The blade bit deep into Garrock's shoulder, spraying dark blood across the clearing. The Doombull bellowed in pain, but retaliated with a backhanded swing of his great axe. The strike caught Kael across the chest, tearing through fur and armor and leaving a gash that oozed black ichor. The Warband roared in approval, their bloodlust rising with every blow. Kael staggered but did not fall. He snarled, his fury building into an unstoppable tide. "Is that all you've got, Garrock? You'll have to do better than that to take my place." With a feral roar, Kael lunged. He feinted left, drawing Garrock's guard, then spun to the right, his axe slicing upward. The jagged blade caught Garrock under the chin, severing his jaw and sending a torrent of blood gushing onto the ground. The Doombull reeled, his massive frame swaying as he tried to steady himself. Kael wasted no time. He drove his horns into Garrock's chest, lifting the massive creature off the ground and slamming him into the earth with bone-crushing force. Kael raised his axe high, the firelight glinting off its blood-stained edge. "The gods demand strength," he roared, "and I am their chosen." With a single savage strike, Kael brought the axe down, splitting Garrick's skull and silencing the Doomball forever. The clearing fell silent as Kael rose, his crimson fur soaked in blood, his chest heaving with exertion. He turned to the Warband, raising his axe high above his head. "Let this be a lesson to all who would challenge me," Kael growled, his voice carrying through the clearing. "I am the Beastlord of the Blood Claw, chosen by the gods. Follow me, and we will crush all who stand in our way. Defy me, and you will meet the same fate as Garrick." The warband erupted into a cacophony of brays and cheers, their savage loyalty renewed by the display of strength. Kael had proven himself once more, his dominance cemented in blood. As the warriors resumed their revelry, Kael stood over Karok's lifeless body, his crimson eyes blazing with unholy fire. The Chaos Gods had tested him, and he had triumphed. His path to the Rift Axe was clearer than ever. But Kael knew that the challenges ahead would only grow more brutal. The Beastlord smirked, his fangs glinting in the firelight. Let them come. He would crush them all. Chapter 11. The Bray herd marches. The Drakwald forest trembled with the braying cries of beastmen. Their savage voices carried through the thick canopy like a wave of unrelenting chaos. The Warband, led by Kael Bloodfang, once a fractured and desperate group, had grown into a fearsome Bray herd. The Rift Axe, in Kael's grasp, pulsed with unholy power, its aura drawing others to him like moths to a flame. Beastmen from smaller bands, scattered across the Drakwald, began to emerge from the shadows. They were drawn not only by the tales of Kael's ferocity, but also by the palpable presence of chaos radiating from him. Each group that joined the Bray herd swore fealty with savage displays of strength, submitting to Kael's rule or falling beneath his axe. Kael stood at the head of the growing horde, his crimson fur streaked with black veins that pulsed faintly in the dim light. His fiery eyes scanned the clearing as yet another group of beastmen arrived, a snarling band of gores and ungores led by a shaggy bestigor with twisted horns. The bestigar stepped forward, his claws gripping a crude grey axe. He glared at Kael with a mix of defiance and respect. "We've heard of you, Kael Bloodfang," he snarled. "The gods favor you. Prove your strength and we'll follow." Kael's lips curled into a feral grin. Without hesitation, he raised the Rift Axe and charged. The battle was swift and brutal, the Rift Axe cleaving through the Bestigar's defenses with ease. As the defeated leader fell to his knees, Kael placed a clawed hand on his bloodied shoulder. "You're mine now," Kael growled. "Serve me, and I'll lead you to glory. Defy me, and I'll feed you to the gods." And Burton spat something out as he tossed Sputer to the ground. The remaining beastmen brayed their submission, their loyalty cemented by the display of strength. The Bray herd grew larger with each victory, their savage cries echoing through the forest as they prepared for the march deeper into Blackhorn territory. The growing horde. The march began at dawn, or what passed for dawn in the eternal gloom of the Drakwald. The Bray herd, now numbering in the hundreds, moved as one, their heavy footsteps and guttural brays shaking the ground and scattering smaller creatures into the shadows. Gores, bestigors, ungores, and even a few towering minotaurs formed the core of the horde, their weapons crude but deadly, their bodies scarred and battle-hardened. At the center of the procession, Kael marched with his chosen warriors. Kurvek, the towering bestigor, strode at his side, his great axe resting on his shoulder. Skrineth flitted through the shadows, his sharp eyes scanning for potential threats. Ulga Bonegrinder lumbered behind them, the massive tree dragging a splintered tree trunk that served as his weapon. Jakra's absence was keenly felt. The Bray shaman's treachery and subsequent death had left the Warband without a conduit for chaos sorcery, but Kael's connection to the Rift Axe seemed to fill that void. The weapon thrummed with energy, its unholy light guiding the Bray herd like a beacon. The forest watches. The Drakwald forest seemed to stir in response to the Bray herd's march. Trees twisted and groaned, their gnarled branches reaching toward the horde like skeletal fingers. The air grew heavier with each step, the scent of rot and decay mingling with the metallic tang of chaos. The forest spirits, ever watchful, seemed to recoil from the Bray herd's presence, their whispers growing fainter as Kael's power consumed the land. Skrineth fell into step beside Korvek, his voice low. "The forest doesn't like this," he said, his eyes darting toward the shifting shadows. "It's watching us." Korvek grunted, his gaze fixed ahead. "Let it watch. It'll burn like the rest." Skrineth smirked, though the unease in his eyes remained. "You're confident for someone who saw what this forest did to Chakra." "Yes." Korvek shot him a glare but said nothing. The forest's wrath was not easily forgotten, but Kael's presence had emboldened the horde. They marched with the certainty that their Beastlord's strength would overcome any challenge. Deeper into Blackhorn territory. As the Bray herd crossed into Blackhorn territory, the signs of their enemy became more evident. Crude totems carved from bone and stone marked the borders, their surfaces smeared with dried blood. The scattered remains of sacrifices littered the ground, rotting corpses of both man and beast, offered to the gods in a futile bid for favor. Kael halted the horde at the edge of a wide ravine. Beyond it lay the Blackhorn warherds' domain, a twisted expanse of jagged rocks and dense forest that bristled with the promise of violence. The Beastlord raised the rift axe high, its glow illuminating the faces of his warriors. "This is the heart of their territory," Kael growled, his voice booming across the ravine. "The Blackhorns think they own this land, but the gods have chosen us to take it. Their herdstones, their warriors, their power, it all belongs to the Bloodclaw now." The Bray herd erupted into savage cheers, their braying cries shaking the trees and echoing through the ravine. Kael grinned, his fiery eyes blazing with unholy light. The march had brought them to the brink of war, and the final confrontation with Maldrak's forces was close at hand. The call to arms. As the Bray herd prepared to cross the ravine, Kael's chosen warriors gathered around him. Skrineth spoke first, his voice sharp. "The Blackhorns know we're coming. They'll be ready." Kael turned to the Ungor, his grin widening. "Let them prepare. It won't save them." Korvek stepped forward, his massive frame towering over the others. "The Bray herd is ready, Beastlord. Give the order, and we'll tear them apart." Kael raised the rift axe, its glow casting long shadows across the clearing. "The gods demand blood," he snarled, "and we will give it to them." The heavy physician was ready for the approaching cipher. "My dear friend, we are the gods." With a roar, the Bray herds surged forward, their weapons clashing and their voices rising in a deafening cacophony. The march into Blackhorn territory had begun in earnest, and the path ahead was soaked in blood and chaos. The forest seemed to tremble as the Bray herd advanced, their savage cries carrying the promise of destruction. Kael led the charge, the rift axe blazing in his claws, his crimson eyes fixed on the horizon. The gods had chosen him, and he would not fail them. Chapter 12. The Iron Gorge. The Iron Gorge was a natural choke point, its steep walls rising like jagged black teeth on either side of a narrow, winding path. The rocky terrain was barren, with little cover save for the occasional cluster of thorny shrubs clinging to the cliffs. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the faint whispers of the wind echoing through the gorge. Kael Bloodfang halted his Bray herd at the mouth of the pass. His crimson eyes scanned the terrain with a predator's instinct, and the rift axe in his grasp pulsed faintly, its glow illuminating the shadowy crevices. The gorge was the most direct route deeper into Blackcorn territory, but it felt too convenient. Kael growled low, his clawed hand tightening on the haft of his weapon. Skrianath, the Ungor tracker, slinked forward from the shadows, his daggers glinting faintly. "It's quiet," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "Too quiet. This reeks of a trap." Hervek, the hulking Bestigor, snorted. "Let them try, we'll smash them like the others." Kael raised a claw to silence them. His gaze lingered on the cliffs above, where the faintest movement betrayed the presence of enemies. The warband brayed uneasily, their tension palpable. Kael turned to face them, the rift axe blazing brighter as he raised it high. "Let them come," he roared. "The gods demand strength, and we will show them that none are stronger than the Bloodclaw." With that, he led the warband into the gorge. The traps sprung. They were halfway through the gorge when the ambush began. A guttural horn blast shattered the stillness, and from the cliffs above, Maldrak's forces descended like a tidal wave. Black-horned beastmen leapt from the rocks, their crude weapons gleaming in the dim light. Boulders were rolled down the slopes, crushing warriors beneath their massive weight. Arrows and jagged spears rained down, striking with deadly precision. The Bloodclaw Bray herd erupted into chaos as the enemy fell upon them. Gors and Ungor screamed as they were cut down, their blood soaking the rocky ground. Kael roared, his fiery eyes blazing as he swung the rift axe in wide arcs, cutting down any foe foolish enough to come near. Around him, his chosen warriors fought with savage ferocity, but the tide of Blackhorn warriors seemed endless. Station missile fire, desperate fighting. Corvic waded into the thick of the battle, his massive great axe cleaving through flesh and bone. He roared with fury as he cut down a towering Blackhorn Bestiger, but even he was beginning to falter under the relentless assault. "Beastlord!" he bellowed, blood streaming from a wound in his side. "We're outnumbered. They'll overwhelm us." Skrianath darted through the melee, his daggers flashing as he struck at the throats and backs of the Blackhorn warriors. "This was planned," he hissed, his sharp eyes scanning the cliffs. "They're herding us, driving us toward the center of the gorge." Kael snarled as he swung the rift axe, the weapon's unholy energy tearing through a cluster of attackers. His mind raced as he surveyed the battlefield. The Blackhorn forces were, indeed, driving them into a bottleneck, where they would be surrounded and slaughtered. The Chaos Gods whispered in his mind, their voices demanding blood and vengeance. "Use what you have taken, Bloodfang. The gods do not reward hesitation." And so it was that the startling watch held its breath to hear more. Kael's fiery gaze turned to Chakra, who stood near the rear of the formation. The Bray shaman's staff glowed faintly, but his usual confidence was replaced with unease as he watched the battle unfold. "Mass! Ju! Whoa!" Kael roared, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "Do something, or I'll feed you to the troll." Chakra's sorcery. Chakra hesitated for only a moment before raising his staff, his guttural chants rising above the din. The winds of chaos swirled around him, stirring the dust and debris at his feet. The glow of his staff grew brighter as he poured his will into the spell, his voice crackling with power. The ground beneath the Blackhorn forces began to shift and crumble. Jagged shards of rock erupted from the earth, impaling attackers and cutting off their advance. A swirling vortex of green fire appeared at the center of the gorge, its flames consuming anything that came too close. The Blackhorn warriors faltered, their brays of triumph turning to screams of terror. Kael seized the opportunity. "Blood Claw!" he roared, his voice filled with unholy power. "Cut them down! Show them the wrath of the gods!" The warband rallied, their weapons clashing against the stunned Blackhorn forces. Korvek led the charge, his great axe carving through the enemy with renewed vigor. Skrinath darted between foes, his daggers striking with deadly precision. Even Yulga Bonegrinder, the massive troll, seemed invigorated by the chaos, his tree-trunk clubs smashing through the enemy ranks. The escape, despite the devastation wrought by Chakra's sorcery and the warband's renewed efforts, the losses were heavy. Dozens of warriors lay dead or dying, their bodies trampled beneath the chaos of battle. Kael knew they could not hold the gorge much longer. "Fall back," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the melee. "To the cliffs! Regroup!" The warband obeyed, retreating toward a narrow path that wound up the side of the gorge. The Blackhorn forces pursued, but the swirling flames of Chakra's vortex slowed their advance, giving the Bloodclaw enough time to escape. Ar was the last to ascend, his crimson eyes blazing as he turned to face the battlefield. The rift axe glowed brighter in his claws, its unholy light illuminating the carnage below. He raised the weapon high, his voice a guttural roar. "This is not over, Maldr. The gods demand your blood, and I will deliver it." The Blackhorn forces brayed in response, their guttural cries echoing through the gorge as Kael disappeared over the edge. Aftermath. The survivors gathered on a rocky plateau overlooking the gorge. Their numbers had been halved, and those who remained were bloodied and exhausted. Skrinath leaned against a boulder, his daggers slick with blood. "That was close," he muttered, his sharp eyes flicking toward Chakra. "Too close." Chakra lowered his staff, his shoulders slumping as the glow of chaos faded. "The gods favor us," he said, though his voice lacked conviction. Kael turned to face the warband, the rift axe still blazing in his claws. His crimson eyes burned with fury and resolve. "This was a test," he growled, his voice booming across the plateau. "The gods demand strength, and we have shown them ours. Maldr's forces will pay for this ambush. We march, and we will crush them beneath our hooves." The warband brayed weakly in response, their loyalty shaken but not broken. As they prepared to move deeper into Blackhorn territory, the rift axe pulsed in Kael's grasp, its unholy light a reminder of the power and the price of chaos. Chapter 13. The Cave of Whispers. The forest around the warband grew darker as they followed Kael Bloodfang deeper into the Drakwald. The chaos moon, Moisleep, hung low in the sky, its sickly green light filtering through the gnarled branches. The whispers that had haunted Kael's dreams had grown louder, echoing in his mind even during the march. They spoke of a place, a sacred site hidden within the forest. A cave where the gods' will could be heard clearly. Kael raised a clawed hand to halt the warband. His crimson eyes scanned the surrounding shadows, and the rift axe pulsed faintly in his grip, as if guiding him. "We're close," he growled. "The gods have called us here. Their knowledge waits for those strong enough to claim it." The warband brayed uneasily, their savage faces betraying their fear, Even Korvek, the hulking bestigor, shifted uncomfortably. "This place feels wrong," he muttered, gripping his great axe tightly. "The air, it hums with something unnatural." It occurred to the Liaden that there shrink alongside the room. His dragon stalked with rapturous reluctance to relieve Kael. Grunting, Kael sighed, his sharp eyes narrowing as he peered into the gloom. "If this is a trap, Beastlord, it's a clever one." Kael snarled, silencing the younger. "The gods do not lay traps, they test, and we will not fail." It took less than 5 seconds for gold. The cave. They came upon the entrance suddenly, the forest parting to reveal a jagged maw of stone that yawned open like the mouth of some ancient beast. The air that seeped from the cave was cold and damp, carrying with it a faint metallic tang. Strange symbols, carved deep into the rock, glowed faintly with green and crimson light, their alien shapes shifting subtly as the warband approached. Chakra's absence was keenly felt. The Bray shaman's knowledge of such symbols would have been invaluable, but his betrayal and subsequent death had left the warband without a sorcerer. Kael clenched his teeth at the thought, but pushed it aside. The rift axe hummed in his claws, and the whispers in his mind grew louder, urging him forward. "The gods are here," Kael said, his voice reverent and cold. "Their will awaits inside. Follow me, or stay and die in ignorance." The warband hesitated, their loyalty strained by the losses and Kael's growing instability. But the fear of his wrath and the allure of chaos drove them to obey. They followed him into the cave. Chaos warped knowledge. The interior of the cave was vast, its walls lined with jagged crystals that glowed with an eerie, pulsating light. The whispers grew louder as the warband descended deeper, the echoes distorting and overlapping until they became a deafening cacophony. The light from the crystals seemed to move, casting shifting shadows that played tricks on the eye. Skrinath froze, his daggers drawn. "Something's here," he hissed. "I can feel it." Kael ignored him, his focus on the rift axe, which now burned brightly in his claws. The whispers coalesced into words, their guttural tones resonating in his mind. "Here, you can truly calm yourself. Kael Bloodfang, chosen of chaos. Your destiny lies within. Take what is yours." At the center of the cavern stood a massive stone altar, its surface etched with runes that pulsed in time with the whispers. The air above the altar shimmered, forming a translucent portal that swirled with colors that defied comprehension. Kael approached, the rift axe vibrating in his grip. "The gods have brought us here for a reason," Kael growled, turning to face the warband. "Step forward and receive their knowledge." Visions of madness. One by one, the warriors approached the altar, each drawn by the whispers. As they neared, the portal flared, enveloping them in a ghostly light. Each warrior staggered back, their eyes wide with terror or madness. Korvek was the first. The massive bestigor approached with his usual bravado, but as the light consumed him, he froze. His roars of defiance turned to guttural screams, and he fell to his knees, clutching his head. When he rose, his eyes burned with an unholy fire, but his face was etched with fear. "The gods, they showed me death," he growled. "Blood, fire, endless war. This is what they demand." Skrinath followed, his sharp mind braced for whatever the gods might reveal. But as the light engulfed him, he let out a choked gasp. When he stepped back, his hands trembled, his daggers clattering to the ground. "They know," he whispered, his voice trembling. "They see everything, even even the betrayal in our hearts. Ulgar Bonegrinder, the troll, lumbered forward, his dim mind unable to comprehend the significance of the altar. The portal flared, but the troll simply growled, his dull eyes unfocused. Whatever the gods showed him was beyond his understanding. Kael was the last to step forward. The portal flared brighter than ever, and the whispers rose to a deafening crescendo. The visions that flooded his mind were vivid and consuming. He saw himself standing atop a mountain of corpses, the rift axe raised high as the chaos gods themselves watched in approval. He saw the Drakwald forest burning, its twisted spirits bowing before his might. But there were other images, visions of betrayal, of his warband turning against him, and of himself consumed by the very power he sought to wield. And the vision ended, Kael staggered back, his claws tightening on the rift axe. His crimson eyes burned with fury and determination. "The gods demand blood," he growled, "and we will give it to them." The fractured warband. The warband gathered outside the cave, their faces pale and their eyes haunted. The visions had shaken them, their loyalty and sanity pushed to the breaking point. Skrinat lingered at the edge of the group, his sharp eyes flicking toward Kael with suspicion. Korvac gripped his great axe tightly, his knuckles white as he muttered prayers to the gods. Kael turned to address them, his voice cold and commanding. "You have seen the gods' will. Their path is clear. We march toward glory, and none will stand in our way." Skrineth stepped forward cautiously, his voice low. Kael's fiery eyes locked onto the Ungor, his lips curling into a snarl. "The gods reward strength, Skrenath. If you are afraid, you are weak, and if you are weak, I will cut you down myself." The warband brayed weakly in response, their loyalty fractured, but their fear of Kael outweighing their doubts. As they prepared to march deeper into Blackhorn territory, the whispers from the cave lingered in their minds, their meaning and intent seeping into their thoughts like poison. Kael led them forward, the rift axe blazing in his claws. The chaos gods had spoken, and their demands were clear, but the cost of their knowledge was yet to be paid. Chapter 14. Maldrak's Challenge. The heart of Blackhorn territory was a roiling nexus of chaos. Dark winds howled through the jagged peaks and shadowed canyons, carrying the echoes of monstrous brays and the ceaseless clamor of warherds preparing for slaughter. At its center loomed the great Herdstone of the Blackhorn warherd, a monument of towering black rock etched with runes that bled raw power into the air. Around it, hundreds of beastmen gathered, their twisted forms brimming with savage fury. Kael Bloodfang approached the Herdstone with his warband, their crimson eyes reflecting the ominous glow of the surrounding chaos energy. The smaller bands of beastmen that had flocked to Kael's banner followed close behind, their numbers swelling the ranks into a Bray herd vast enough to rival any in the Drakwald. But they knew this was no simple battle. This was a reckoning. At the base of the Herdstone, surrounded by his most savage warriors, stood Maldr the Defiler, the Beastlord of the Blackhorns. His hulking form exuded menace, his dark fur matted with dried blood and adorned with bone trophies from countless conquests. In his clawed hand he held the rift axe, its jagged edge glowing faintly with the unholy light of chaos. Maldrak's glowing eyes narrowed as Kael and his warband approached, their crimson and black banners fluttering in the cursed winds. The tension between the two beastlords was palpable, a storm of fury and ambition poised to explode. "You dare come here, Bloodfang." Maldrak's voice was a guttural snarl, his fangs bared. "You trespass on my domain, challenge my rule, and think you can take the Rift Axe? You are a fool." Kael stepped forward, his massive frame casting a long shadow. His voice was a deep, thunderous growl. "The Chaos Gods have chosen me, Maldr. Your time as Beastlord is over. Stand down, or I will break you." Maldr laughed, a cruel, mocking sound that echoed through the canyon. "You think you are strong, Kael. But strength is not enough to wield the Rift Axe. The gods demand more. They demand blood, pain, and madness. Let us see if you are worthy." He raised the Rift Axe high, its glow intensifying as if answering his challenge. Around them, the gathered warherds brayed and howled, forming a massive ring around the two Beastlords. The duel would decide the fate of all who stood there. The fight began with a thunderous roar as the two titans collided, their weapons clashing with a sound like thunder. Kael's jagged axe arced through the air, its blade aimed at Maldric's chest. Maldr deflected the strike with the Rift Axe, the sheer force of the impact sending shock waves through the ground. Voice shrank back, remaining calm as they held their close status. Ray froze, thinking about Ike. Maldr countered with a brutal swing, the Rift Axe trailing a shimmering aura of raw chaos energy. Kael dodged, but the edge of the blade grazed his armor, sending sparks flying and leaving a smoking gash in the metal. The power of the Rift Axe was palpable, its unholy energy warping the very air around it. Kael snarled and pressed forward, his strikes growing faster and more savage. He drove Maldr back with a relentless barrage, his crimson eyes blazing with fury. But Maldr was no ordinary foe. He met each strike with brutal precision, his strength and cunning honed by years of dominance. The duel raged on, each Beastlord exchanging devastating blows that would have felled lesser warriors. The gathered warherds roared with bloodlust, their cries fueling the intensity of the battle. Around the Herdstone, the very ground seemed to pulse with chaos energy, feeding the ferocity of the combatants. Kael saw his opening when Maldr overcommitted to a wide swing. Sidestepping the blow, Kael drove his horns into Maldr's side, the jagged tips tearing through flesh and bone. Maldr bellowed in pain, but he retaliated with a backhanded strike that sent Kael sprawling. Both warriors staggered, their bodies battered and bleeding, but neither showed any sign of surrender. Kael's vision blurred, the world around him fading as a surge of raw fury consumed him. The Chaos Gods whispered in his mind, their voices urging him to claim victory. "Rise, Kael Bloodfang. Show your strength. Take what is yours." Kael roared and surged forward, his axe glowing faintly with unholy light. Maldr raised the Rift Axe to block, but Kael's strike was faster, more precise. His blade slammed into Maldr's shoulder, severing the arm that held the Rift Axe. Maldr howled in agony, black ichor spraying across the ground. Kael didn't stop. He drove his axe into Maldr's chest, the jagged blade cleaving through bone and muscle. Maldr fell to his knees, his strength fading, his defiant gaze locking onto Kael. "The gods will never favor you," Maldr rasped, blood bubbling from his mouth. Kael leaned in close, his crimson eyes burning. "They already have." With a final, savage strike, Kael severed Maldr's head, holding it high for all to see. The gathered warherds erupted into frenzied brays and roars, their cries echoing through the canyon. The Beastlord of the Blackhorns was dead, and Kael Bloodfang stood victorious. Kael turned to the Rift Axe, its unholy glow pulsating with power. He reached down and lifted it, the weapon feeling both impossibly heavy and unnaturally light in his claws. The moment his fingers closed around the haft, a surge of chaos energy coursed through him, strengthening his body and mind, but also warping them. The warherds knelt, their heads bowed in submission. Kael raised the rift axe high, his voice booming over the cacophony. "I am Kael Bloodfang, Beastlord of the Drakwald. The gods have chosen me, and all shall kneel before my power." The Bray herds roared in unison, their savage cries shaking the earth. Kael stood atop the broken body of Maldr, the rift axe in his hand and the favor of the chaos gods burning in his soul. He waved away the fury with which chaos gods burdened him. The path to total dominance had begun. The surrounding structure was peaceful. Chapter 15. The Shrine of Corruption. The Shrine of Corruption rose from the center of a twisted, barren clearing, deep within the Drakwald forest. Jagged spires of blackened stone jutted into the sky, etched with glowing runes that pulsed like veins feeding an unseen heart. The air was thick with the stench of decay and the hum of chaos magic, so oppressive that even the most hardened of Chaos's warriors faltered. Kael Bloodfang stood at the head of his warband, his crimson eyes fixed on the shrine. The rift axe burned in his claws, its unholy power surging with a will of its own, urging him forward. Around him, the warband shifted uneasily, their savage faces betraying fear they dared not voice. The closer they drew to the shrine, the more warped the forest had become. Trees twisted into grotesque shapes, their bark weeping dark ichor, and the ground cracked and oozed with unholy corruption. "This is the place," Chakra had said before his death, his voice filled with awe and dread. "The god's power is strongest here." Kael snarled, shaking the memory of the treacherous Bray shaman from his mind. His focus was on the task ahead. The relic awaited him. Its power would make him unstoppable. The guardians of the shrine, scalding, from the Italian scaldings, well, I take that for an expression. As the warband approached the shrine, movement stirred in the shadows. At first, it was subtle, an unnatural ripple in the air, the faint scrape of claws on stone. Then, they emerged. Chaos spawn, grotesque, hulking creatures twisted beyond recognition by the taint of the warp, lumbered forward on malformed limbs. Their bodies were a patchwork of writhing flesh, tentacles, and jagged bone, their many eyes glaring with hatred. Among them were the mutated remnants of the Blackhorn warherd, their forms barely recognizable as beastmen. Their horns had grown into spiraling spires of bone, their guttural brays carried an unnatural echo. Kael raised the rift axe high, its glow cutting through the gloom. "Blood Claw! The gods demand blood! Kill them all!" Vital said, the Adstadas having the best of the day, and their own equipment sufficient. Its warbands charged. The assault. The clearing erupted into chaos as the two forces collided. Kael led the charge, his monstrous frame cleaving through the front line of chaos spawn with savage efficiency. The rift axe's power shattered their malformed bodies, each swing releasing arcs of destructive energy that carved through flesh and stone alike. But for every abomination he struck down, more surged forward, their grotesque forms seemingly endless. Garrick's replacement, the Bestigor Korvek, fought like a demon possessed. His massive great axe tore through the Blackhorn mutants, their corrupted blood spraying across the battlefield. But even he struggled to keep the tide at bay. One of the chaos spawn lashed out with a tentacle, wrapping it around Korvek's leg and dragging him into a mass of writhing flesh. His roars of defiance were quickly silenced. Skrinoth darted through the melee, his daggers finding weak points in the mutants' armored hides. He fought with desperation, his small frame allowing him to avoid the worst of the carnage, but his sharp eyes could see the truth. The warband was being overwhelmed. Ulgar Bonegrinder, as always, was a force of raw destruction. The troll swung a massive tree trunk like a club, smashing chaos spawn into unrecognizable pulp. Yet even he began to falter, the sheer number of foes wearing him down. The shrine's power. The battle raged on, the ground beneath them slick with blood and ichor. But it wasn't just the guardians of the shrine that posed a threat. The shrine itself seemed alive, its pulsating runes feeding energy into the chaos spawn. The corrupted earth sapped the strength of Kael's warriors, while the tainted air burned their lungs. Kael roared in defiance, the rift axe blazing in his hands. He carved a path toward the shrine, his vision narrowing to the relic that awaited him within. Every step was a battle, every swing of his weapon an act of sheer will. The gods demanded his strength, and he would not fail them. The warband, however, was not so fortunate. Warriors fell in droves, their bodies torn apart by the relentless assault. Skrinnath watched in horror as his comrades were dragged into the seething mass of chaos spawn, their screams cut short by wet, crunching sounds. Kael reached the base of the shrine, his massive frame heaving with exertion. The rift axe pulsed in his hand, its glow matching the rhythm of the runes. The remaining chaos spawn seemed to falter, their movements slowing, as if the weapon's presence unnerved even them. Turning back, Kael bellowed to his surviving warriors, "Hold the line! The gods favor the strong! Do not falter!" He heard shouts of accusation and screams. The cost of victory. With one final surge, Kael unleashed the rift axe's full power. The weapon's unholy energy exploded outward, disintegrating the nearest chaos spawn and mutants in a blinding flash of light. The shockwave tore through the battlefield, scattering enemies and allies alike. When the dust settled, the clearing was eerily silent. The chaos spawn were gone, their bodies reduced to ash. The shrine's runes had dimmed, their glow fading as if drained of power. Why? Kael stood alone at the foot of the shrine, the rift axe in his claws. His warband was shattered, reduced to a handful of bloodied, exhausted survivors. Skrinnath and Ulgar limped toward him, their eyes wide with disbelief at what they had witnessed. Kael excused himself to support the others from the rift. Kael turned to them, his crimson eyes burning with triumph. "The gods have tested us, and we have prevailed. The relic is mine." He stepped forward, ascending the steps of the shrine. At its center lay the relic, a pulsating core of chaos energy, its form barely contained by jagged shards of black stone. Kael reached out, his claws closing around the artifact. As he lifted it, the rift axe blazed brighter than ever, its power fusing with the relic's energy. Kael's body trembled as the Chaos God's voices filled his mind, promising power beyond imagining. But the price of such power had yet to be paid. Kael descended from the shrine, the relic's energy now coursing through him. His warband knelt before him, their loyalty born of equal parts awe and terror. The Beastlord's victory was undeniable, but the cost had been immense. The Bloodclaw warband was broken, its survivors left to wonder what horrors awaited them next. As the twisted winds of the Drakwald howled around them, Kael raised the rift axe high, his voice a guttural snarl. "The gods have blessed me. The Drakwald is mine." The gods, watching from beyond, whispered to each other, their laughter echoing across the warp. Kael had claimed the relic, but chaos never granted power without consequence. Shh. Chapter 16. The Relic's Power. The Shrine of Corruption loomed over Kael Bloodfang, its blackened spires etched with runes that pulsed faintly in the dim light of the chaos moon, more asleep. At its heart lay the relic, cradled within jagged shards of obsidian. It was a weapon of raw, unfiltered power, a chaos-forged axe that radiated destruction. The artifact seemed to hum with a light of its own, its dark energy rippling through the air, distorting the light around it. Kael stood before the relic, his crimson fur matted with the blood of his enemies. The rift axe in his claws seemed to resonate with the weapon before him, their energies aligning in a cacophony of chaos that filled his mind with the whispers of the gods. His breath was heavy, his body battered from the brutal assault on the shrine. But his resolve was unbroken. The surviving members of his warband knelt behind him, their forms trembling with exhaustion and fear. Skrinnath, the cunning Ungor, clutched his daggers tightly, his sharp eyes darting nervously between the relic and Kael. Olgar Bonegrinder, the troll, sat slumped against a boulder, his monstrous body riddled with wounds that slowly knit themselves back together. The others had fallen, their bodies strewn across the battlefield, consumed by the horrors they had faced. Kael reached out, his clawed hand closing around the haft of the chaos-forged axe. The moment his fingers touched it, a surge of power coursed through him, so intense it brought him to his knees. The relic's energy burned through his veins, filling him with a strength and fury unlike anything he had ever known. The Chaos God's voices roared in his mind, louder than ever before. Kael Bloodfang, you have proven your worth. The relic is yours. With it, you shall ascend, becoming our true champion. But beware. Such power demands a price. Kael gritted his teeth, the voices threatening to split his skull. I will pay it, he growled, his voice thick with determination. I will pay whatever price you demand. Kael reached past his desk and grabbed a single file, closing his eyes for a moment. The god's laughter echoed in his mind, a sound both mocking and approving. The transformation. As Kael rose, the relic now firmly in his grasp, his body began to change. The axe pulsed with unholy energy, its jagged edge gleaming with a light that seemed to devour the surrounding darkness. The power of the relic fused with Kael's being, reshaping him into a vessel of chaos. His already imposing frame grew larger, his muscles bulging with unnatural strength. Black veins of chaotic energy spread across his crimson fur, glowing faintly as if his very blood had been infused with the warp. His horns twisted and lengthened, their jagged tips crackling with dark energy. His eyes, once burning coals, became blazing orbs of molten fire, their light piercing the gloom of the shrine. The Warband watched in awe and terror as their Beastlord transformed. Skrinnath fell to his knees, his daggers slipping from his hands. He is becoming something else, the Ungor whispered, his voice trembling. Yuruk. Ulgar tilted his massive head, his dim eyes narrowing as he watched the transformation. Even his simple mind could sense the magnitude of what was happening. Kael raised the chaos-forged axe high, its blade glowing brighter with each passing moment. His voice, now deeper and more resonant, boomed across the shrine. I am Kael Bloodfang no longer. The gods have made me their scourge. The Drakwald shall bow before me, or it will burn. Her voice became stronger, sharp, the relic's influence. But with the relic's power came its price. The whispers in Kael's mind grew louder, more insistent. They no longer merely urged him to conquest. They began to twist his thoughts, feeding his paranoia and hunger for domination. He felt his mind slipping, his will bending to the weapon's insidious influence. His gaze fell on his warband, their battered forms kneeling before him. Once he had seen them as his strength, the force that would carry him to victory. Now they seemed weak, unworthy of the power he wielded. A part of him wanted to strike them down, to test the full extent of his newfound strength. "Beastlord," Skrinath said cautiously, his voice breaking the heavy silence. "The Warband stands ready to follow you. What are your orders?" Anil's slivery eyes locked onto the Ungor, and for a moment Skrinath thought he would be struck down. But Kael lowered the axe, his voice a guttural snarl. "We march. The gods demand blood, and I will not disappoint them." The warband brayed weakly in response, their fear of Kael outweighing their doubts. They rose, their loyalty now born of terror rather than respect. The path forward. As the warband trudged away from the shrine, the forest seemed to bow before Kael's presence. The twisted trees groaned and shifted, their gnarled branches reaching out like supplicants. The very air crackled with the energy radiating from the chaos-forged axe, warping reality around them. Kael marched at the front, his massive frame radiating power. But inside, the whispers grew louder, the Chaos God's voices blending with the Relic's insidious will. He could feel his mind fraying at the edges, his thoughts no longer entirely his own. Still, Kael pressed forward, the rift axe and the chaos-forged relic fused into a single weapon of unimaginable destruction. He would lead his warband to glory, crush all who stood in his path, and claim dominion over the Drakwald. But deep down, a sliver of doubt gnawed at the edges of his soul. The gods had granted him power, but their laughter echoed in his mind. Kael's triumph was undeniable, but the price of his ascension had only just begun to reveal itself. Chapter 17. The Forest's Wrath. The Drakwald was no ordinary forest. It was a living, breathing entity, steeped in the unholy energies of chaos. Its gnarled trees, warped over centuries of exposure to the warp, exuded a malevolent presence. But the shrine of corruption, now desecrated by Kael Bloodfang's triumph, awakened the forest in ways no one could have foreseen. As the warband moved through the tainted woods, the air became thick and oppressive, charged with an unnatural stillness. The faint whispers of the chaos gods in Kael's mind were now joined by something older and more primal. A deep groaning sound echoed through the trees, followed by a sharp, splitting crack. The forest itself seemed to shudder, its ancient limbs stirring to life. Skrinath, ever watchful, stopped dead in his tracks, his daggers drawn. "Something's wrong," he hissed, his sharp eyes scanning the darkness. "The forest. It's moving." Kael snorted, his fiery eyes glowing like twin embers. "Let it come," he growled, gripping the rift axe. "The gods have made me their champion. Nothing will stand in my way." The forest awakens. The ground beneath the warband's hooves began to shift, the dirt rippling like water. Massive roots erupted from the earth, twisting and coiling like serpents. The warband scattered, braying in alarm as the roots lashed out, ensnaring those too slow to react. One Ungor was dragged screaming into the ground, his cries muffled as the forest swallowed him whole. The trees themselves groaned and creaked as they shifted, their gnarled branches elongating into claw-like appendages. Faces, twisted and grotesque, began to emerge from the bark, their hollow eyes glowing with an eerie green light. Spectral spirits drifted from the trees, their ghostly forms wreathed in ethereal flames. Their mournful wails filled the air, sending chills through even the most savage of Kael's warriors. Kael raised the rift axe, its unholy glow illuminating the chaos around him. "Hold the line," he bellowed, his voice cutting through the cacophony. "The gods test us. Show them your strength." Desperate battles. The warband fought for their lives as the forest closed in around them. Gnarled roots lashed out like whips, shattering bones and splintering weapons. The spectral spirits screamed as they descended upon the warriors, their ghostly claws rending flesh and armor with equal ease. Kael roared, his massive frame a beacon of destruction. The rift axe blazed with chaotic energy as he swung it in wide arcs, severing roots and dispersing spirits with each strike. The weapon's power carved through the forest like a storm, but even Kael could not destroy it entirely. For every root he severed, two more emerged. For every spirit he dispersed, another took its place. Granat darted through the melee, his daggers flashing as he cut at the spectral forms. His smaller size allowed him to evade the worst of the forest's attacks, but the Unga knew they couldn't hold out forever. "Beastlord," he shouted, "this place will consume us." Korvac, the hulking Bestigor, fought with savage fury, his great axe tearing through the spectral forms, but even his strength was not enough. A massive root coiled around his legs, dragging him to the ground. He bellowed in defiance, hacking at the root with his axe, but the forest's strength was overwhelming. His roar was silenced as the earth closed over him. Olgar Bonegrinder fought with mindless rage, his massive fists smashing roots and spirits alike. But even the troll, with his regenerative abilities, began to falter under the endless assault. A spectral spirit latched onto his back, its ghostly flame searing his flesh. Olgar howled in pain, thrashing wildly to dislodge the creature. Kael's fury. Kael snarled as he watched his warband falter. The rift axe burned in his claws, its power thrumming through his veins. The chaos gods whispered in his mind, their voices blending with the anguished wails of the forest. "Destroy it, Bloodfang. Show us your strength. Burn the forest and claim its power." With a roar, Kael drove the rift axe into the ground. A shockwave of chaos energy erupted from the weapon, rippling through the clearing and shattering the roots around him. The spectral spirits wailed in agony as the energy tore through their forms, banishing them back to the shadows. The forest recoiled, its groaning and creaking momentarily silenced. Kael stood in the center of the devastation, his chest heaving, his crimson fur matted with blood and ichor. The rift axe glowed brighter than ever, its unholy power feeding on the destruction. The warband's fragmentation. The survivors of the warband gathered around Kael, their bodies battered, their eyes filled with fear and doubt. Skrinat approached cautiously, his daggers still drawn. "Beastlord," he said, his voice trembling. "The forest, it's alive. It will not stop." Kael turned to him, his fiery eyes burning with madness. "The forest is nothing compared to the will of the gods," he snarled. "We will burn it to ash." Skirnath hesitated, glancing at the remaining warriors. They were few now, their once mighty warband reduced to a handful of bloodied survivors. The forest's wrath had taken its toll, and even Kael's strength seemed fragile in the face of its endless fury. Olga lumbered forward, his massive frame hunched with exhaustion. The troll's simple mind could not comprehend the enormity of what they faced, but even he seemed uneasy, his dim eyes darting nervously toward the shifting trees. Two of the boys stood pattern, gripping their scythes tightly. The forest groaned again, its roots stirring as if preparing for another assault. Kael raised the rift axe, its glow cutting through the gloom. "The gods demand strength," he growled. We will give it to them." The warband brayed weakly in response, their loyalty shaken but their fear of Kael outweighing their doubts. As the forest stirred around them, the survivors prepared for another desperate march, knowing that the Drakwald's wrath was far from spent. Kael Bloodfang led them onward, the rift axe blazing in his claws. The forest might rage against him, but he would not be broken. The Chaos Gods had chosen him, and he would prove his worth, no matter the cost. Chapter 18. Fractured Allegiances. The once cohesive warband of the Bloodclaw warherd had become a fractured, volatile force as they trudged deeper into the haunted heart of the Drakwald. The rift axe, now in Kael Bloodfang's possession, radiated an aura of overwhelming chaos, warping the minds and bodies of those who lingered too close for too long. The weapon's power was undeniable, but its influence was corrosive, eroding the bonds that had once held the warband together. Peering in blood-splattered face, his eyes blazing with fury. Kael stood at the front of the procession, the rift axe slung across his back. His crimson fur, already marred by countless battles, was now streaked with unnatural black veins that pulsed with eerie light. His eyes burned brighter than ever, but there was a new madness in their depths, a hunger that no amount of bloodshed could satisfy. Behind him, the warband followed in uneasy silence. Whispers spread through the ranks, hushed, venomous murmurs of discontent. The rift axe had changed Kael, they said. The once fearsome Beastlord was no longer merely a champion of chaos, but a puppet of its unfathomable will. Chakra, the Bray shaman, watched Kael intently from the rear of the group, his glowing eyes narrowing with suspicion. The rift axe's power was undeniable, and the visions it had granted him during their assault on the Shrine of Corruption had shown him more than just Kael's potential. They had shown him his own. He clutched his staff tightly, muttering incantations under his breath as he contemplated the unthinkable. The gods whisper to me as well, Chakra thought, his lips curling into a jagged grin. Kael may be strong, but he is not irreplaceable. The rift axe could be mine. With its power, I could shape the Drakwald in my image. Chakra wasn't the only one harboring doubts. Skrinath the Tracker had grown increasingly uneasy since Kael's transformation. The Ungor had always trusted his instincts, and they now screamed that Kael was no longer the leader they had followed into Blackhorn territory. Calling out a word of praise for Skrinath, Kael returned. During a quiet moment, Skrinath sidled up to Garrick's replacement, a hulking bestigor named Korvac. "This is madness," Skrinath hissed. "The rift axe has changed him. Kael leads us to ruin." Korvac grunted, his massive horns gleaming in the dim light. "He's strong, stronger than any Beastlord we've known. The gods favor him." Trenath's sharp eyes glinted with defiance. "The gods favor strength, not madness. Look around you. The warband is falling apart. Chakra schemes and the others grow restless. If we don't act, we'll all be slaughtered when Kael finally loses control." Kael was not blind to the unrest within his warband. The whispers reached his ears, and the sidelong glances of his warriors did not escape his notice. But he did not care. The rift axe thrummed with power, and the Chaos Gods whispered to him constantly now, their voices promising glory beyond imagining. He had no need for loyalty. If his warband faltered, he would replace them with stronger, more savage warriors. One night, as the warband camped near a cluster of ancient, withered trees, the tension reached a breaking point. Chakra approached Kael under the guise of seeking his counsel, but his staff crackled faintly with dark energy, a subtle preparation for betrayal. "My lord," Chakra began, his voice oily and smooth. The Rift Axe has brought you great power, but its burden is heavy. Perhaps you might share its glory so that the Warband may grow stronger together. Kael turned his burning gaze on the Bray shaman, his claws tightening around the haft of the Rift Axe. "You think to wield it, Chakra," he growled. "Do you believe the gods have chosen you?" Chakra's lips twisted into a grin, his confidence bolstered by the magic coursing through his veins. "The gods speak to me as they do to you, Kael. Perhaps their will has shifted. Perhaps they demand new leadership." The camp fell silent as the warband gathered to watch the confrontation. Kael rose to his full height, his crimson fur bristling. Chakra hesitated, his confidence faltering as the weapon's raw power washed over him. The Bray shaman raised his staff, the runes along its length glowing with sickly green light. He unleashed a torrent of sorcery, dark tendrils of energy lashing out at Kael. Kael roared and swung the Rift Axe, the blade cleaving through the magic as if it were nothing. The backlash sent Chakra sprawling, his staff clattering to the ground. Kael advanced, his crimson eyes burning with fury. "Exercise. You dare challenge me?" Kael thundered, his voice shaking the very earth. "You dare defy the will of the gods?" With a single brutal strike, Kael brought the Rift Axe down. The blade didn't just cut. It annihilated. Chakra's body disintegrated in a burst of green flame, his defiance snuffed out in an instant. The warband stared in stunned silence, their brays and growls subdued by the sheer display of power. Kael turned to face them, the Rift Axe glowing faintly in his clawed hand. "Let this be a lesson to all of you," Kael growled. "The Rift Axe belongs to me. The gods have chosen me to lead. Obey or share Chakra's fate." The warband brayed their submission, but the cracks in their unity remained. Skrinath and a handful of others exchanged wary glances, their doubts growing stronger. The Rift Axe had granted Kael immense power, but it was clear that the weapon's influence was driving him to the brink of madness. As the warband marched deeper into the Drakwald, their path lit by the unholy glow of the Rift Axe, one thing was certain: Kael's rise to power had come at a terrible cost, and the fractures within his ranks threatened to shatter them completely. Chapter 19. The Final Battle. The Drakwald forest had become a cauldron of chaos, its once oppressive silence shattered by the cacophony of battle. The remnants of Maldrak's Blackhorn warherd, bolstered by vengeful forest spirits and creatures twisted by chaos, had gathered for one final stand. The air itself seemed to hum with unholy energy, the taint of the Rift Axe radiating outward like a storm, enraging both allies and enemies alike. Kael Bloodfang stood at the front of his warband, the Rift Axe burning with raw destructive power in his clawed hand. His crimson fur bristled as he surveyed the battlefield. Hundreds of beastmen and monstrous entities howled and roared, their bloodlust palpable. The time had come to claim ultimate dominance, or to fall in a maelstrom of slaughter. Kael raised the Rift Axe high, its glow illuminating his savage visage. "Bloodclaw!" he roared, his voice carrying over the din. "Today, the gods watch us. Today we bring ruin to our enemies and claim our destiny. Forward to glory." The warband erupted in a chorus of brays and roars, their weapons clashing against shields as they surged forward. The opposing forces met with a deafening crash, the earth trembling beneath the weight of the carnage. Kael carved a path through the battlefield, the Rift Axe cleaving through flesh, bone, and even reality itself. Each swing unleashed arcs of destructive energy that disintegrated anything in their path. The remnants of Maldr's forces fell before him like wheat to a scythe, but their numbers seemed endless. The Blackhorn warriors fought with a desperation born of vengeance, their savage determination matched only by their hatred for Kael. Carrick's replacement, the Bestigor Korvek, bellowed orders to the Warband, rallying the faltering lines. His great axe swung in wide arcs, scattering enemies with sheer brute force. Skrinoth darted through the chaos, his daggers finding the throats of distracted foes. Even Olgar Bonegrinder, his simple mind unable to comprehend the stakes, smashed and stomped with mindless glee, his massive fists crushing all in his path. But it wasn't just the Blackhorn forces that the Bloodclaw Warband faced. The forest itself had turned against them. Massive, twisted roots erupted from the ground, ensnaring warriors and dragging them into the earth. Spectral spirits, their forms wreathed in ghostly flames, swept through the battlefield, their howls chilling the blood of even the fiercest beastmen. Monstrous, chaos-twisted creatures emerged from the shadows, their forms bloated and malformed, driven to madness by the Rift Axe's presence. Hild roared as a massive chaos spawn lunged at him, its writhing tentacles flailing wildly. The Beastlord swung the Rift Axe in a brutal arc, the weapon's unholy energy disintegrating the creature in an explosion of ichor and gore. He turned to face another foe, his crimson eyes burning with rage, his fur matted with blood and ichor. "Is this all you have?" Kael bellowed, his voice echoing across the battlefield. "You cannot stop me. None can stop me." The crew fell silent, as if aroused by the unexpected violence. Despite Kael's ferocity, the battle began to take its toll. The Bloodclaw Warband, already battered and fractured, was being torn apart. Warriors fell in droves, their bodies trampled underhoof or consumed by the vengeful forest. Skrinoth barely escaped a spectral wraith, his quick reflexes saving him from a deathly embrace, but his confidence faltered as he watched his comrades die around him. Korvek fought valiantly, his massive frame a bulwark against the enemy, but even he could not hold forever. A towering Blackhorn Minotaur charged him, its massive axe cleaving through armor and flesh. Korvek fell with a defiant roar, his blood soaking the earth. Chakra's absence was keenly felt. The Bray shaman's treachery and death had left the warband without a sorcerer to counter the spectral forces that now wreaked havoc among their ranks. Kael snarled at the memory, his grip on the Rift Axe tightening. He would kill them all. Every last one. Kael's rage reached a fever pitch as he charged into the thick of the enemy, the Rift Axe's power warping the battlefield around him. The very air seemed to bend and twist, and with each swing of the axe, reality itself shattered, leaving voids of nothingness in its wake. Blackhorn warriors fled in terror, their will to fight broken by the sheer savagery of Kael's onslaught. But as Kael looked around, he saw his warband reduced to a handful of survivors. Skrinoth crouched behind a fallen tree, his daggers drawn but his face pale with fear. Olgar continued to fight, his massive fists swinging wildly, but his wounds were severe and his movements were slowing. The forest spirits began to converge on Kael, their ghostly forms flickering in and out of existence. They howled with rage, their twisted faces contorted with hatred for the intruder who had desecrated their domain. Kael snarled, raising the Rift Axe high. "Come then, face me, and die." The spirits surged forward, their spectral forms colliding with the unholy energy of the Rift Axe. Kael swung the weapon with reckless abandon, obliterating everything in his path. But the strain of wielding such power began to show. His movements grew erratic, his vision blurred, and the voices of the Chaos Gods became a deafening roar in his mind. Kar backed up. By the time the battle finally ended, the field was littered with the dead and the dying. Kael stood alone at the center, his body battered and his fur soaked with blood. The rift axe still glowed in his clawed hand, its power undiminished, but its toll on him unmistakable. The calm emerged from the shadows, his steps hesitant. Kael turned to face him, his crimson eyes blazing. Then they were weak. Olgar shambled forward, his body riddled with wounds, his massive frame sagging under the weight of his injuries. The troll's simple mind could not comprehend the loss, but even he sensed that the Bloodclaw Warband was broken. Kael raised the rift axe high, his voice a guttural snarl. "I am the Beastlord of the Drakwald. The gods have chosen me, and nothing will stop me. Not Maldr, not this cursed forest, and not death itself." The surviving remnants of the warband brayed weakly in response, their loyalty wavering, but their fear of Kael undeniable. As the cursed winds of the Drakwald swirled around them, Kael Bloodfang stood triumphant. But his victory was a hollow one, and the price of his power was yet to be fully paid. Chapter 20. The Ascension. The battlefield lay silent, save for the faint rustling of the warped Drakwald winds. Kael Bloodfang stood atop the blood-soaked ruins, the rift axe in his clawed hand glowing with an unholy light. Around him the remains of his warband, now little more than a handful of battered survivors, knelt in a mixture of awe and terror. The bodies of his enemies, beastmen and twisted forest spirits alike, littered the ground, their blood seeping into the corrupted earth. The Chaos Gods whispered louder now, their voices no longer mere echoes in Kael's mind, but a deafening roar of power and promise. The rift axe pulsed in rhythm with his heartbeat, its chaotic energy fusing with his very essence. Kael's crimson fur bristled. His horns glowed faintly as his body began to shift and warp. Kael turned to his warband, his burning eyes scanning their bloodied, exhausted forms. "You have seen what I am," he growled, his voice deeper and more resonant than before. "The Chaos Gods have chosen me as their true champion. No Beastlord, no warherd, no power in this forest or beyond can stand against me." His declaration echoed through the Drakwald, carried by winds thick with the taint of chaos. Skrenath the Tracker, his daggers trembling in his hands, dared to raise his voice. "But, Beastlord, the gods, their gifts, they demand a price." Kael's gaze snapped to the Ungor, silencing him with a glare. "The gods demand strength, Skrenath, and I have proven mine." As he spoke, the rift axe began to glow brighter, the runes etched into its surface blazing with uncontainable energy. The ground beneath Kael cracked and shifted, black tendrils of chaos energy spiraling upward around him. The whispers of the gods grew louder, their words incomprehensible to the others, but clear to Kael. "Kael Bloodfang, you have pleased us, but the power you crave is not without sacrifice. To wield the rift axe is to embrace the will of chaos itself. Will you pay the price?" Kael raised the rift axe high, his muscles straining as the weapon grew heavier in his hands. His voice boomed across the battlefield, filled with rage and defiance. "I will pay whatever price the gods demand. I am their chosen, their champion. No price is too great for ultimate power." The Chaos Gods laughed, an awful, resonant sound that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. The tendrils of chaos energy coiled tighter around Kael, lifting him into the air. His body twisted and contorted as raw power surged through him, his screams of pain and triumph mingling into a guttural roar. The Warband watched in stunned silence as their Beastlord began to ascend. Kael's form grew larger, his crimson fur darkening to black and his horns lengthening into jagged spires. His claws extended into talons, and his eyes became twin orbs of blazing fire. The rift axe fused with his hand, its power coursing through his veins and reshaping his very essence. Skrinov whispered to Korvek's hulking form, his voice trembling. "He's becoming something else." Korvek, bloodied and battered, simply nodded. "He is no longer Kael. He's a daemon." Above them, Kael's transformation reached its climax. His body now towered over the battlefield, his monstrous form radiating an aura of pure chaos. His voice, no longer entirely his own, boomed like thunder. "I am Kael Bloodfang no longer," he roared. "I am the scourge of the Drakwald, the true champion of chaos. All will kneel before my power, or they will burn in the fires of destruction." The rift axe, now an extension of his arm, pulsed with each word. The ground around him cracked and burned, the forest itself recoiling in terror. Trees twisted and withered, and the surviving spirits of the Drakwald fled into the shadows, unable to withstand his presence. But as chaos basked in his triumph, the laughter of the chaos gods grew louder, their amusement taking on a sinister edge. The tendrils of chaos energy around Kael did not dissipate. Instead, they began to tighten, constricting him, even as his power grew. Kael's blazing eyes widened as he realized what was happening. "What is this?" he roared, his voice tinged with panic. "I am your champion. You gave me this power." "This body stands revealing." The gods' voices rang out, terrible and final. "Greater than we gave you power, Bloodfang. But chaos is never satisfied. Your triumph is fleeting, your purpose fulfilled. Now you belong to us." The Warband watched in horror as Kael's monstrous form began to dissolve, his screams echoing through the forest. His body, now a vessel of chaos energy, collapsed inward, consumed by the very power he had sought to control. The rift axe remained, glowing faintly amidst the ruins, its unholy power untouched. The silence that followed was deafening. The handful of survivors, battered and broken, stared at the place where their Beastlord had stood moments before. Skrinov was the first to speak, his voice barely a whisper. "He's gone. The gods. They took him." Korvek nodded grimly. "Chaos takes all in the end, even its champions." The Warband, now leaderless and shattered, slowly began to retreat. The rift axe remained behind, a terrible reminder of Kael's rise and fall. The Drakwald forest reclaimed its eerie silence, its twisted shadows closing in around the battlefield. Kael Bloodfang had achieved his destiny, but at a cost he could never have foreseen. His ascension was a testament to the power of chaos and to its cruel, capricious nature. The gods had chosen him, used him, and discarded him as they always did. The Drakwald whispered his name no longer. All that remained was the rift axe, waiting for the next fool who dared to claim it.